Greetings, dear listeners, and welcome to SciFrights, the film discussion podcast from the interzone where horror meets science fiction. My name is Liam Dunn, and I am a screenwriter, film critic, and a lifelong science fiction fan.
My name is Dr. Lindsay Hallam, and I am the course leader of the Film and Screen Studies degree at the University of the Arts London, who specialises in horror cinema.
And we are in fact partners both in life and in crime, and we are die-hard film fanatics.
Today we continue our season on director double bills. In this episode we are talking about one of my absolute favourite directors and someone I've been dying to discuss, David Cronenberg.
We will be focusing on two key films. First up, we'll explore how a broken marriage spawns monstrous offspring in The Brood, and what happens when a scientist's self-experimentation goes terribly wrong. When does it not? In body horror masterpiece, The Fly.
And just a reminder to everyone in podcast land, we are going to spoil the hell out of these films. So if you want to watch these films first, please go ahead and we'll be here when you get back.
Joining us today, we have an incredible guest, so pleased to have him with us. It's comic book artist and author, Stephen R. Bissette.
Good afternoon to you. Good morning from here, but good afternoon for you.
Have you seen anything good recently?
Well, let's see. Best thing I've seen recently, I just revisited Good Boy, which is still one of my favorite films that came out last year.
With the dog, with Indy the dog.
With the dog. You know, part of why I love the film is it plugged into a different way of seeing the world. I mean, we're seeing the events unfold through the eyes of a canine. And I always love movies that take me somewhere I can't go or won't go in my real life. Relevant to the movies we'll be talking about today. But I really enjoyed Good Boy. And what else have I seen recently? I just saw, oh my God, I'm going to forget, the 2551 trilogy, which Deaf Crocodile just released here in the States. And it's a long 3-part feature, each part being its own feature. Essentially a silent film, although there's sound, there's no dialogue spoken. And it immerses you in this subterranean post-apocalyptic world where a protagonist who's wearing an ape mask, a very lovable ape mask, you sort of fall in love with the character, steps in and picks up a little kid. And everybody in the film is wearing a mask. There's nobody without a mask in this universe. And the moment he picks up the child, he's responsible for the child. And it's basically over the arc, you know, what happens over a great span of time between these two characters. But it was remarkable. I don't know if I can recommend it. How many people will invest 5 hours or more of their lives into this bizarre experience? But I really, really loved it. So
where is it from?
It was quite an enigma to me. It's a film I'd never heard of before. It's from a filmmaker named Norbert Pfaffenbichler. It's an Austrian film. Apparently, it was made over almost a 10-year period, starting in 2021. And it's unlike anything I've ever seen. And I love films that are unlike anything I've ever seen. So I definitely recommend 2551 trilogy for adventurous film viewers like yourselves. So
okay. Yeah.
Sounds great.
Prepare yourself. All
right. And I mean, you sent through your article on the Gamma people. Is that mostly what you're doing at the moment, is writing for like the film magazines?
God, I'm doing so much. I mean, behind me is a banner for my comic book character Tyrant from the 1990s. And right now there's a Kickstarter going on for a hardcover 2 different volume reprint collection of this comic I did back in the 1990s. And that's prompting me to reconsider everything I'm going to do over the next few years. And I've also been writing a lot. The Gamma People piece was for the final issue of Dick Clemenson's zine, Little Shop of Horrors, which began as a Hammer Films-centric zine. And over the decades, Richard has expanded the scope to all British genre films. And this was the final issue, and it really frustrates me that other than Joe Dante Jr., nobody on Earth seems to like the Gamma People, which I've loved since I was, I don't know, I think I saw it when I was 10 years old. And I love the film, and I tracked down through a friend in California the original Robert Aldrich script from 1950. It was going to originally be a very different film than the one that was made in 56. And in the same archive was the shooting script for the film that John Gilling made. So that'll be seeing print in Little Shop of Horrors. I've got an article on cryptid cinema, Bigfoot movies coming out in Men's Adventure Quarterly later this month. So yeah, I'm doing a lot of writing for film magazines, but I've also been writing for DC Comics. They're doing a series of new collected omnibus editions of Jack Kirby's The Demon from 1970s and a procession of Swamp Thing omnibus editions. And I'm contributing text features to each of those, I think, actually, as it's turning out. And Tim Lucas and I are doing another video bonus feature for Hammer Films. We were just invited to contribute to X the Unknown, another favorite film from my child. I think it's the first Hammer film I ever saw. It was on TV. And it's also a film that my beloved wife, Marjorie, we're celebrating our 24th wedding anniversary this coming month, April. When we were first dating, she told me that when she was 9 years old, she fled a movie theater because the movie terrified her so much. And she said, I think it was called the Unknown X. And I said, no, X the Unknown. So it's really fun to be able to get together with Tim Lucas and do something for that package. And Tim and I are also going to be doing a video bonus feature for an Alexander Patushko film from Russia called Scarlet Sails. Most of Patushko's films were heroic fantasies of fairy tale films. This is perhaps his only non-fantasy feature film. Although being a period film, it has that, that fantastic historical element to it. So I'm keeping busy. I'll put it that way.
I think so. It sounds like it. Oh my God. But you're mentioning the Gamma people and X the Unknown. I think that's kind of a good place for us to kind of go into, because so our podcast, we say the interzone where horror meets science fiction, which is very relevant to what we're talking about today.
Exactly.
But for you, where did your love for horror and science fiction come from?
That's a great question, Lindsay. When I'm being glib, I say I was raised Catholic, which is only partially being glib because it's true. You're brought up with all that hellfire and brimstone preaching every Sunday, and horror makes a lot of sense through that lens. I gravitated to science fiction because of my love of dinosaurs. I was one of those little kids that my mom would read dinosaur children's books to me, and she couldn't pronounce the names, but I could. So I literally learned how to read from my obsession for dinosaurs, and that inevitably led me to science fiction films, primarily The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms being the formative influence. The Ray Harryhausen, Eugene Laurie film from 1953. And I was hooked from that point on, and there was a horror component to The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, beyond the giant Rhedosaurus, the dinosaur, which was the dinosaur in the film has a virulent strain of some sort of prehistoric disease that its blood spreads as a contagion, and it's a fairly understated element in the film, but it's there. And because of my love of dinosaurs, I struggled through Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth as too young a reader. And that led me to H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, which was the transformative novel for me. And from that point on, I read everything I could get my hands on. And late 50s, early 60s, even our local small town library in northern Vermont, the Waterbury Public Library, had a rack of paperbacks, and I would grab any science fiction paperback that was there. And most of them were short story collections. The Martian Chronicles, Third from the Sun, Richard Matheson, I would just devour that stuff. So authors like Bradbury, Matheson, Beaumont, eventually Lovecraft, all that pulled me into loving science fiction and horror, and I got addicted to Edgar Allan Poe at a very early age as well. And as you both know, he had his fair share of science fiction elements in some of his stories. And in terms of film, I was an opportunivore. Anything that popped up on television that even vaguely suggested in the television guide might be a genre film, I would watch. And as a result, I was lucky that between the Canadian TV stations we got in Northern Vermont and the 3 American network stations we got, I got to watch a lot of early meaning, silent era to 1960s films on television growing up. And then once I had my driver's license, it was all over but the tears. I went to the drive-in 2 to 3 times a week as a teenager. And here in America, the drive-ins, they often offered double bills, but there were a lot of triple bills and Dawn the Dust shows as well. So real crash course in the films you both love and that I love.
And so when you're yourself working in either horror and science fiction, because I've been listening to a lot of interviews with Cronenberg, and he was kind of saying, genres when he's working, he doesn't really kind of think about genre or consider that. I don't know for you, do you feel like when you're working in either genre or across the genres, do you see much crossover between them, or are you even thinking about genre convention at all when you're working in this space?
That's a great question. I see genre as language. I really do. Because I write fiction as well as nonfiction, but I'm best known for my comics work, where it's a visual storytelling medium, and every genre has its visual tropes. We see a man on a horse wearing a cowboy hat. We immediately bring all this baggage to the image. And that means you as a storyteller can play into that, play off of that, play against that. I mean, so that's why I think of genre as language. And just as the Inuit language has many, many words for snow because, they're a culture that evolved in Arctic environments. Genre also has each of them have their own idiosyncratic language. Now, part of why I love science fiction horror is, to me, those are opposed genres. Horror is an emotion-fueled genre, okay? It's irrational by nature. And I would also cite comedy and romance as similarly emotive genres. They're driven by emotion, so they don't have to be rational. In fact, in comedy, the less rational, often the more effective. And the same is true with horror. Science fiction is a very rational genre, much like an Agatha Christie mystery or most drama. It tends to be linear in nature, and it engages the intellect as well as the emotions, but it's not driven by emotions necessarily. When you put the two together and the way they play off of each other, and particularly when you're in the hands of a real master like David Cronenberg, you can go anywhere with it. So to your question, when I'm working, I don't think about genre. It's a language I'm fluent in, much like we're all 3 of us speaking in English. Both the 2 of you and myself are versed in the genre we're talking about. So we have a lot of common ground in terms of the language we're going to be using to communicate. And it just comes natural to me, I've attempted working in other genres and it's fun, but the one that just comes out of me tends to be horror. And science fiction will often play a role in it, but as in my dinosaur comic series Tyrant, my intention was to present a portrait of what it was like to be a prehistoric animal 75 million years ago. By its very nature, that means I'm doing science fiction. It's also because I'm telling it from the point of view of one of these magnificent creatures, and it's a carnivore, that pushes me into the horror element right there. Right. Because I think horror tends to put us on the food chain, horrically or literally, it bumps us down the food chain, and that's part of the power of it. Science fiction asks, well, what is a food chain? and propels it that way. So I'm not thinking about genre per se when I'm working creatively, but that's just my comfortable language. That's what I settle into. And I think the same is true of filmmakers and storytellers like David Cronenberg. I think David Lynch inhabits a similar territory. Mario Bava, one of my all-time favorite filmmakers, clearly that was where his leanings were. So I think it's common language for us.
So I guess we should get into David Cronenberg, why we're here today.
Let's do it.
So our last episode, we looked at John Carpenter and we looked at Escape from New York and The Thing. And we were talking with our guest, Travis Johnson, a film critic. So we were just talking about how John Carpenter had kind of been there, you know, very present in our childhoods, especially like something like Big Trouble in Little China. And I was trying to think about my history of David Cronenberg, and he is someone who's making films for adult audiences. I don't remember really him being around when I was a kid. I think I remember my mom talking about The Fly and I think Dead Ringers and just going, oh my God, he vomits on his food and it was just disgusting. But yeah, I think it was only when I got much older and getting into films that I discovered David Cronenberg. And possibly my first one, I think may have been actually Naked Lunch, because my older brother loves William Burroughs.
Oh, yeah.
So he found the book, he got into the book and then he watched that. And also David Lynch was a big thing when I was a teenager. And so everyone always talks about David Lynch and Cronenberg because they share the first name. So that's, I think, how I would have found Cronenberg. So what is your history with Cronenberg, and kind of where were you there from the beginning, or was there a particular film that you remember first seeing of his?
Well, before I answer that, okay, so Naked Lunch was what you recall being your first exposure. And Liam, what was your first exposure to David Cronenberg, dare I ask?
I think I always remember hearing about The Fly and people telling me about it and it sounding terrifying. But I think Videodrome might be my first one that I remember seeing. And I remember just getting it sort of being recommended to me and buying it sight unseen from a video stall at a mall, basically. Yeah, I think that's my favorite of his, just because it left such a massive impression on me.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my God. And can I also ask what age each of you were when you were first exposed to the Cronenberg world?
It would have been late teens. Yeah. It must have been like 16, 17.
Okay.
I think. Okay. I feel like, yeah.
Yeah. Roundabouts.
And same for you. Now, for me, I was born in 1955. So I first heard of Cronenberg when Shivers opened in America as They Came From Within, but I didn't get to see it when it first came out. I only heard about it. I remember driving with friends. I think I was visiting a college buddy in Maryland, and inevitably we decided, let's drive around Washington D.C. Like I'd never been to the capital of our country, and we went by a little movie theater, and there was a poster out front for They Came From Within, which had a woman in a bathtub. That was the image, woman in a bathtub screaming, and beyond the power of an exorcist, They Came From Within. But I couldn't go see it. So my first exposure was I had moved from Vermont to New Jersey for a couple of years. I was a student at the Joe Kubert School of Cartoon and Graphic Art in Dover, New Jersey. And we were lucky enough in Dover that there was a downtown theater that was still active, the Baker Theater. And they brought in every New World Pictures and every American International Pictures feature or double bill. And I saw Rabid. That was my first Cronenberg film. And, my classmates that I went to see it with, one of them had seen Behind the Green Door. So Marilyn Chambers was the draw for them. I was completely freaked out because while the film narrative was making sense to me, I found that my body was reacting on its own. Does that make sense? And I was like, I was beginning to actually physically shake in certain sequences as Rose, Marilyn Chambers' character, is now driven by whatever the thing in her armpit is, which was never explained sufficiently in the film. Later, it made perfect sense when I read the interview with David Cronenberg in Cine Fantastique. And my body was reacting separate from my mind. Like, intellectually, I was having fun with the movie. I was engaged. The bigger scope narrative of this strain of rabies spreading through Montreal, causing urban panic, that was the through line. But my body was reacting to a whole other movie. And I didn't have another experience like that until I saw Eraserhead, which is why I put Lynch and Cronenberg together in my head, probably within the same year. And I had to go back and see Rabbit the very next night because, like, I was like, what happened to me? You know, and I didn't think it was a great movie, but obviously it had attacked me on a cellular level. And I love cinema. I was lucky enough to grow up with experimental and avant-garde and underground films in my teenage years, as well as mainstream films. So I was really intrigued by kind of the alchemy of what was going on. Like, how is this doing this to me? And I was a Cronenberg addict from that night on, because any artist that, you know, whether it's a musician, a painter, a writer, any artist that's hitting me on that primal a level is important to me. So Rabid was my starting point. And then after that, I saw every one of his films as they came out, with the only one I had to backtrack to being Shivers, They Came From Within, which I finally caught around 1979 or 80 when it came back around Vermont Drive-In for a weekend.
So we're going to talk about two of his films today, The Brood and The Fly. So before we get into The Brood, so as I was kind of going over his career, it does feel like there are distinct phases he progresses through. So he starts with these underground experimental films. Well, he makes some short films, and then his first kind of feature-length films are Stereo from 1969 and Crimes of the Future of 1970, which are those more kind of underground experimental films that he was getting into festivals. So I think Crimes of the Future was financed by the Canadian Film Development Corporation, which was quite new at the time. Yep. And then he gets into his early genre features. So you've got Shivers 75, Rabid 77, The Brood 79, Scanners 81. And then within that, you've got Fast Company in 79, which is kind of this strange outlier, which I actually haven't seen.
but Fast Company is really important to Cronenberg's body work. He described it as the first film where sets were built for him, right? They Came From Within and Rabid was all shot on the road. They were doing everything classic, low budget, independent style. And with Fast Company, for the first time, he had control over what was going to appear in front of his camera. And he could work with a production designer, Carol Spear, who could build stuff to fit what he needed or what he wanted. So I share the fact that Fast Company sort of doesn't fit thematically on the through line. Backtracking through Cronenberg's career, though, it turned out I had seen some of his work on television. He used to do short teleplays for CBC, the Toronto Channel 6 for us in Northern Vermont. And he did a fantastic half-hour one, which if the two of you haven't seen, I highly recommend you track down and watch. It's the closest thing Cronenberg's done to a comedy. I think The Shrouds is a very funny movie in its twisted way. The Shrouds played for me as a really pitch dark comedy. But the one I'm going to recommend to you is The Italian Machine. It informs The Fly, okay, because it revolves around one motorcycle. The Italian Machine is the beautiful motorcycle that this group of bikers are obsessed with, Canadian bikers. And the telepods in The Fly are based on the engine of this, I believe it's a Ducati motorcycle from Italy. And so there is kind of a through line there. It's one of the films we're going to be talking about. But what The Italian Machine is about is a group of bikers in Canada who are going nuts because they find out there's this rare Italian bike, motorcycle that's been purchased, but it's been purchased by an art collector. He's not going to ride it. He only displays it, right, as an art object. And it gets deep into Cronenberg's territory when they try to infiltrate this guy's home because they just want to see the bike. And then, of course, once they lay eyes on it, they have to ride it. And one of the bikers, the one who's the most passionate in his expression, is the actor who plays Mike in The Brood, right? The first character we see in The Brood is Mike in the middle of his therapy with Raglan. And that actor is terrific. And his best buddy is Rose's boyfriend from Rabid, one of those ineffectual Cronenberg heroes who spends the entire movie unable to do anything to help himself, much less Rose. And The Italian Machine is a dual title. When they infiltrate their way into this art collector's home, he has purchased a human being, an Italian, as an art object, as a beautiful man. And these bikers cut a deal with him in order to be able to ride the bike. And that's the comedic aspect of it. That is completely aligned with Fast Company, right? There we're seeing the side of Cronenberg we rarely see, of the guy who's into fast machines, cars, motorcycles, and so on. But I also loved how it dovetailed into both The Brood and The Fly with the design of the telepods. So as Cronenberg fans, I steer both of you to The Italian Machine.
Wow, yeah. I'm sure it's on YouTube
I
or
just looked
something.
it up and it is.
Okay, great.
Oh, it is?
Report
Okay,
tonight.
you'll have some fun with it. Like, have some popcorn and a couple of drinks, and it's only
Brilliant.
a half hour long, but
Yeah.
Oh, great.
it's a wonderful look at a side of Cronenberg that, you know, he could have pursued as a filmmaker, chose not to. So...
And so when I think about the kind of this early phase of his career, there's a quote that I feel like I've probably quoted many times in many essays over the years.
Okay.
Where Cronenberg says, "We're not fully evolved culturally, physically, or in any other way. My films are an attempt to try and perceive what, having said that, a fully evolved human being might look like." So I always think about like so many of his films, and like even his most recent ones. Just last night we rewatched Crimes of the Future. This whole idea that his films are almost like this hypotheses about what is the future of the human body.
Yeah, exactly. And I love, and you're talking about the feature, the newer feature, Crimes of the Future.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry.
The new one.
I love that film. Yeah, I think all of his science fiction horror films are obsessed with that. I mean, the early films have to do with transformation from outside and inside simultaneously. And I think that really culminates in The Fly in a lot of ways, including the fusion of human, insect, and machine by the final act of that film, right? And I also find it interesting that right from the beginning, right from Shivers, he's using the fantasy trope not as a means of metaphor, but to literally transform his characters and to portray for us. I mean, the acting in Cronenberg's films is usually at a very high level. I'm thinking of Lynn Lowry's monologue in Shivers when she's talking about the dream she's had about making love to an old man. And, you know, I mean, that sequence stood out from every other horror film that was playing at that time. Like, we didn't get movies that went there. And I think all his films end up going there. And by the time we get to The Brood, Videodrome, The Fly, we have characters who are speaking directly to us as audience members about what it is to transform, to evolve, and to not be able to keep up with it. You know, whether it's Nola trying to talk to Frank in the final act of The Brood, or James Woods trying to make sense of reality isn't reality anymore to him, or Jeff Goldblum, who is incredibly funny and incredibly direct in communicating what this transformation is that's happening to him as he's going through it. I feel like Cronenberg, as a storyteller, was speaking to all of his audiences at a much higher level than anyone else seemed to be willing to in mainstream culture at that time. It was very rare stuff. It still plays pretty rare, but now we're used to all these miniseries, you know, streaming miniseries where they've got a bigger time canvas. And, you know, part of it is eating up running time, but part of it is the psychology of the character speaking to us, you know, even in a miniseries like The Last of Us. You know, we're very much in a Cronenbergian space now in terms of the imaginative media that's presenting stuff to us. A Black Mirror, any episode of Black Mirror, for instance. So, you know, there's another aspect to those phases you point out, Lindsay, to me too, is for his first 4 feature films, the male characters are pretty ineffectual. And then something really changes with Christopher Walken in Dead Zone and James Wood in Videodrome. It's almost like Cronenberg finally found his voice for himself as a male protagonist. Like, he could be more proactive now. Whereas prior to that, his male characters, a lot of people give Art Hindle short shrift for his performance in The Brood. I think he gives a great performance because, as I spelled out in my book on The Brood, I went through a very different than that, thankfully, domestic ordeal that my first wife Marlene and I and our family went through, and I felt as powerless as Frank. So I watched that film, and to me, it's a very accurate mirror of the space I was living in for a number of years. I get why a lot of people just consider him a cold fish, but let's face it, Frank is way out of his depth. But by the time Cronenberg does The Fly, Goldblum is fully engaged as a human being, and as he ceases to be a human being, he's fully engaged with what's happening to him, trying to understand it, but he's also he wants back his humanity, and he spells that out in that great line about insect politics. So I feel like that's a phase of Cronenberg's work as well, where I think he went through a real growth spurt as a storyteller, perhaps thanks to the strength of not just the scripts he was working with. And in the case of Dead Zone, it was an adaptation of a Stephen King novel. In the case of Videodrome, it was his own script entirely. You can clearly see with those two works, like a gestalt progression into another level of storytelling. And now the male characters are as active as the female characters were in the earlier films.
Yeah, actually, you talk about the Dead Zone. We did watch that the other day recently, and I was struck by the fact that Christopher Walken's character, he spends most of the movie grappling with this new gift and what to do with it, and it's only towards the end when he meets Martin Sheen's character that he takes on that agency. So and then that's where he's actually trying to push forward to change his visions and make some sort of impact on the world. And I find that interesting what you're saying about him, also Cronenberg coming to terms with his male protagonists. It's almost like I can see Cronenberg working through that in that film of like finding the voice for that character and having his motivation at the end being like he's finally taking that stand and understanding his gift, or at least understanding how it works.
Yeah, and I think it's very concrete in the sequence. And again, it's thanks in part to Walken, the way he plays. I mean, no actor delivers like Walken, right?
Yeah.
It's actually the moment of change is when he's able to save the little boy from drowning in the ice. And it's that moment of Johnny finally raising his voice and losing his job in the bargain by slamming his cane down and going, "The ice is going to break." and is there a more expressive phrase we could have fixed to Cronenberg than he himself saying it at that point? Like the ice is going to break, and he broke the ice of these. His male characters tended to be very dispassionate prior to that. Look at the Doctor in Shivers. He's almost like an observer. But it's his own aloof, dispassionate nature. And as Kim Newman pointed out to me a number of years ago, and I think I quoted it in my Brood book, that Kim saw that same actor in another role, and then he realized, Cronenberg directed him to play his character in Shivers like that. Like that was a conscious choice. And Rose's boyfriend in Rabid, and Frank Carbeth in The Brood. I mean, they're males trapped in these impenetrable, unnatural situations that they are never going to be able to cope with. And as audience members, we're barely able to keep up with what is going on here, So I feel like the phase happens with Dead Zone and Videodrome, and by The Fly, Goldblum, right from his first scene at that trade show where he's, he and our heroine are meeting cute, in the terms of romantic comedies, and he goes, "Cheeseburger." in Stathis's office. It at that point I was giddy when I first saw The Fly in 1986, because it's like, wow, Cronenberg's never done this. You really get swept up in the love affair of those two characters, and it's done very quickly. It's almost like a cliche of panning up to the ceiling and then back to them in bed. But he pulls it off. It plays effortlessly, and of course the the chemistry between actress and actor in that, because they were a couple at the time, feels very natural. I mean, it's coming off the screen at us. It still does when we revisit the film today.
Definitely seems to be this progression. In some ways, he seems like, even going back to Stereo and Crimes of the Future, he seemed to arrive kind of fully formed in some ways. I mean, there is these obsessions, this idea of what is the future of the human body, and yet this aspect of science is always there in his films. And with this early phase, I think it was actually a really good article that I read by Carrie Rickey about The Brood. And she actually talks about The Brood as being a third film in a bioterror trilogy. And she kind of says that, each film has a male scientist who tests his therapy on a female.
True.
And then I guess the shift, especially like with The Fly, is that they start experimenting on themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. And James Woods in Videodrome being experimented on by a mad science corporation in that case. But, I also think The Brood stands out, though, because if you read my book, you saw I really wrestle with Robin Wood's accusations against the film on a number of levels. Part of what fascinated me with Cronenberg from the start was, and he said it half jokingly in interviews, like he was on the side of the parasites. That was perfectly in sync with a lot of the science fiction I'd read from my childhood onward, right? There's a lot of science fiction that people would tend to consider cold and clinical, but it can put you in the mindset of an alien species. And whether it's Philip Jose Farmer using that to explore interspecies sexual relationships, or A.E. Van Vogt, where he's putting you in the mindset of these alien creatures that his male astronaut characters are interacting with. Cronenberg was one of the first filmmakers I ever experienced who was doing that in his films. And I think with The Brood, I always found Nola the most powerful character in the entire film. Like, she's more powerful than Raglan. Raglan's afraid of her, right? I mean, just look at the geography of The Brood, right? We gradually are introduced to the Psychoplasmics Research Center, the complex in the woods. But we don't get to that cabin until late in the film, right? And that's Nola's domain. We only realize once we've seen the outside of the building, that's where we were during Raglan and Nola's first session. She's in there, and we don't even know what the Brood are. We haven't heard the word. We only hear the word brood once, and that's from Raglan when he's trying to explain to Frank what he has to do when the shit has now hit the fan. So Nola is sort of like the queen in her castle to me. She is the most powerful character in The Brood. So I get Robin Wood and many others who have considered this an expression of misogyny on a personalized level. It clearly was motivated by David Cronenberg's conflict with his first wife and the dissolution of their marriage and the concern over their daughter. But I also look at it as like Lady Macbeth, Medea. I mean, in terms of classic literature, Nola fits right in there. And she's a very sympathetic character. We see her vulnerable through most of that film, emotionally vulnerable. And Raglan's out of his depth completely. My wife, Marjorie's normal. I'm not normal. You can tell that, right? And she was curious about The Brood because I'd written this book, and we watched it last night. She watched it with me. Marge was a school psychologist, career-wise. She thought it was a really good film, which surprised me. I didn't know if it went too far. And she really liked it. And we ended up having quite a dialogue after. And I think part of the power of The Brood is Nola's character. And I think I read as much, when you mentioned Carrie Rickey's piece, I read as much about the authors as I do about the film when I read those kind of pieces. Like, okay, where are they fitting in terms of how they're perceiving this? Because a lot of people misinterpret parts of the film. I think a lot of people take at face value Nola's accusations, and yet we're only told, piecemeal what might have been the backstory. Nola is clearly not a reliable narrator in this story. Raglan proves he's not a reliable participant in the story. I mean, he essentially kills that teacher by mischaracterizing her in his therapy session with Nola. Like, he's suddenly playing the adulterer, and this feeds her rage. And he essentially sets up that teacher for death by Brood. And Frank my heart goes out to Frank, because he is never going to figure out what the hell really went on, right? So anyway, sorry, I wander afield with that answer, but I really see Nola as a heart in Cronenberg's body of work that morphs into bisexual and mixed gender characters when we get further into his filmography. Does that make sense? You know, I feel like he was finally wrestling with his own anima through the character of Nola. And because he wrote the screenplay as well, I really feel it's one of his most mature works. He's certainly the most mature work in those three films you referenced, Lindsay, that Carrie had written about. And I think it's a culmination of those three as well.
Definitely. So we should just get straight into The Brood.
Okay, let's do it.
They come from the unknown, and they're here now, hiding, waiting to strike. You can feel their presence all around you. Never before have you come this close to the edge of terror. Never before have you faced anything so strange and sinister, so bizarre and unnerving. Never until now. David Cronenberg's The Brood.
Are you ready for me, Frank? I seem to be a very special person now. I'm in the middle of a strange adventure.
I want to go with you wherever you go.
Do you?
Yes.
Then look!
The Brood. You can run. You can hide and hope they won't find you. But you won't escape. Once unleashed, The Brood will destroy anyone who gets in their way. David Cronenberg's ultimate experience in inner terror, starring Oliver Reed and Samantha Eggar. The Brood. They're waiting for you.
Frank Carveth, Art Hindle, is a man going through a painful, acrimonious divorce. His ex-wife Nola, Samantha Eggar, is in treatment at the Soma-Free Institute of Psychoplasmics under the care of Dr. Hal Raglan, Oliver Reed, who believes that repressed emotions and trauma can be manifested on the body as a way to excise them. Nola is working through the trauma of abuse inflicted on her by her mother, Juliana, as well as feelings of abandonment related to her father, Barton, who did nothing to stop this abuse. Frank goes to pick up their daughter, Candy, Cindy Hines, after a stay with Nola and is alarmed to find cuts and bruises on her back. He feels Candy is in danger and wants full custody of her. He is warned that if he does not allow Candy to continue to visit Nola, he will get into legal trouble. While Nola continues her therapy, Frank takes Candy to visit Juliana, who tells Candy that when Nola was a child, she was often in hospital because she would wake up with ugly bumps on her skin. Juliana goes to freshen her drink when she is suddenly attacked and killed by what seems to be a small, child-sized figure. Candy is now further traumatized after witnessing the murder. Juliana's ex-husband and Nola's father, Barton, arrives for the funeral. Meanwhile, Frank meets up with Jan Hartog, a former patient of Raglan's who believes that psychoplasmics is the cause of his cancer, saying that Raglan encouraged his body to revolt against him and is planning a lawsuit. Candy's teacher, Ruth Mayer, shares some concerns about Candy's behavior with Frank and comes over to the house to discuss it further. Barton goes to retrieve Nola, but Raglan refuses to let him see her. Barton goes back to the old house and calls Frank in a drunken state. Leaving Candy with Ruth, Nola calls home and becomes enraged when Ruth answers, accusing her of taking her husband and killing her family. Frank arrives too late and finds Barton has been also killed by a creature. Frank finds one of the creatures in the house dying. An autopsy reveals that the creature, or broodling, is not a human in a traditional sense. It has no sexual organs, can't speak, and it has no belly button, meaning that it was not born like normal humans. At school, more of the broodlings arrive. While 2 broodlings take Candy away, the rest of them attack and kill Ruth. Frank goes to the Soma Free Institute to confront Nola, but Raglan intervenes and says she doesn't know what the broodlings are doing, that they are carrying out her unconscious desires. Raglan goes to save Candy while Frank speaks to Nola, pretending that he wants to reconcile. If she becomes angry, the broodlings will attack Candy as they are manifestations of her rage. Nola reveals her external womb as she births a broodling. Seeing Frank's disgust, she becomes incensed, proclaiming that she would rather kill Candy than let her be taken away. As they argue, the broodlings awaken, and Raglan is killed trying to save Candy. Frank strangles Nola, and the broodlings also die. As they drive home, we see small lumps beginning to form on Candy's arms. So how did you first see this film? So I'm assuming you would have seen it on its first release.
I caught it in reissue. I missed it. I don't think it played in Vermont, where I live, on first release in 1979. But I read Tim Lucas's review in Cine Fantastique, and I knew it was a Cronenberg film. And then it was New World put it back into circulation. New World was real sketchy in terms of, it's impossible to figure out what box office this film actually had, because Roger Corman and New World never reported accurate figures to Variety or the trade papers. But it stayed in release for almost 2 years in America. I tracked its release in the UK, and you folks had a number of shots at it. Well, not you, because it was released before you were old enough to go see The Brood, but it had quite an extended life through Alpha, I think, was the distributor in the UK. And they even double billed it, if I'm remembering correctly, with Dawn of the Dead, which would have been a mind-blowing double feature. I saw it at a drive-in with my first wife, Marlene. We had to drive into northern Massachusetts to catch it. There was a brand new movie out called Mother's Day, a really vicious backwoods rape revenge film that Charles Kaufman wrote and directed. And so we had to endure Mother's Day, which was quite an ordeal, to stay for The Brood. And The Brood was the second feature. And I will de-romanticize drive-ins for you. Right. A lot of people have romantic views of drive-ins. Drive-ins were a tough go, right? The speaker would hang on your car window. This is before piped-in radio sound at the drive-in. So Marlene and I both had speakers hanging on our car windows to hear the film. You can imagine the quality of the sound, perhaps through a car speaker that's hanging on your window. Mosquitoes coming in the window. You could buy this thing called Pick, which was a little green. It looked like the coil of an electric stove, and you would burn it, and it would drive you out of your car as well as the mosquitoes, because it was like a toxic pine smell. Or fog would roll in, or rain would begin to sprinkle down, and this would compromise your viewing. Luckily, The Brood was not interrupted by any of that, and I was blown away with the film completely, and I could not see it again until it was on VHS. It never played again anywhere near me. I mentioned the reissue because right after I saw it at the drive-in, I lucked into a copy of the Boston Phoenix, which was Boston's alternative weekly newspaper. And there was a glowing review about The Brood's revival. And the critic who wrote it up said, just as John Ford was born to make Westerns, David Cronenberg was born to make horror films. And it was the second positive review after Tim Lucas's review that I'd ever read. And I could tell, okay, people are getting it. But it was the hardest Cronenberg film, other than Fast Company. It was the hardest Cronenberg film to see until VHS. It did have a good 2-week play in Boston. New World kept it out in circulation, but it never came back around. And I'm sure you folks had experienced films you saw in a theater that you just didn't know if you'd ever get to see again until the video era kicked in. And once it was on VHS tape, I bought a used copy at a video store out of a $10 bin and revisited it often. That became a really important film.
Liam, do you remember when you first saw it?
I think that's how I got it, was from a $10 bin as well. But it was on DVD. It would have been on DVD though. But I think I do remember so I used to go down to this local store that would just have, and that's where I was picking up things like Death Race 2000 and just random stuff. I'd be like, that looks good, I'll get it, because it was cheap. So it was like, and I think The Brood was part of that. And I knew, because I knew who Cronenberg was at the time, and I was like, oh, I haven't seen this one. And it was just like, and even though I knew his work, it seemed different to me. Like, I just was like, this is so yeah, because of its storyline about the breakdown of a marriage, and I found it really startling.
I would have been in university when I saw it, because I would have been on VHS, and growing up in the suburbs in Australia, you would have your local suburban video store, and it wouldn't have everything. It would be somewhat limited. But there was in Mount Lawley this another kind of more central suburb of Perth where we both grew up. You would have, there was Planet Video, which I ended up working at for a while, but that would have more stuff. Like, they had an actual cult section and, foreign films and all sorts of things. And so I would have seen it there. And then I remember it at university. So I was studying film, thinking I would end up making them. But then I think in my third year, I really started to realize I was more into kind of talking about other people's films. And I wrote in my third year of university a essay, and it was inspired by the quote from Cronenberg about how he felt that The Brood was more realistic than Kramer versus Kramer.
Yes,
and so that was the whole kind of basis of my essay. It was called Death to Realism, which is a quote from Existence. My whole thing was that genre films were more realistic. I had a whole thing about, like, I don't like realism. Like, why? Yeah, it's very ridiculous thing that when you're younger that you feel like you have all these.
Well, I don't think it's ridiculous. I don't think it's ridiculous, Lindsay. A part of why I still love genre is I think it tells truths more directly than drama or melodrama does. I really think that. I mean, I went through, and I wrote about it a bit with my first wife's permission in the Brood book, some of what we went through. And the Brood was the only movie in existence that crystallized and spoke to what we were going through with my first wife's recovered memories of having been abused when she was younger and how that was impacting our family. Now, luckily, we weren't in as bad a situation as the Carvets were, but everything else out there didn't touch it. Even the TV movies that were being broadcast at the time that more and more were evolving, child abuse and sexual abuse, none of them confronted the emotional landscape as directly as Cronenberg did with The Brood. So I think you were onto something. When I was younger, when I was about the age you were when you wrote that essay, I mean, I was going to the drive-in, and it was movies like Night of the Living Dead and the biker movies that were talking more honestly to me about Vietnam War era America than anything else in our culture, other than the 6 o'clock news when we were getting broadcasts of live, feed from Vietnam. So I really believe to this day that genre, because of the vehicle of metaphor, crystallizes emotional spaces in a way that we can recognize and grapple with them in ways that realism doesn't and never will, So I'm with you. Although I understand you're looking back at it saying, oh, what was I thinking?
Well, I would also rail against just realist cinema, and I was like kind of rejecting all of it, which I kind of feel like there's some good realist films. I just took it a bit too far, I think.
Don't you think part of that though was I mean, I felt the same way, but don't you think part of that was our being spoon-fed that genre was lesser somehow, so that reactively we're backlashing, we're lashing out and like, no, you've got it backwards,
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I want to just talk about, I do have, your book is over here. We're not a visual video podcast.
No,
so I can't.
I haven't held my copy up, but I put it close in case it came up. So yeah.
But I can't show it. We can't show how, like, it's not just a book, it's a tome. It's
As every friend of mine has said, it takes 3 times longer to read your book, Steve, than to watch the film 3 times.
Yeah. Yeah. I've made it through most of the book. I haven't got through all the appendices yet.
There's a lot of them, Lindsay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So how did you come to write the book about it?
The editor and founder of the Midnight Movie Monograph Electric Dreamhouse line at PS Publishing in the UK is a man named Neil Snowden. And Neil and I had communicated previously over email, but he reached out to me when he was launching the line. He liked my approach to writing about film that he'd read in various zines and magazines that I'd written for. And he invited me to write a monograph for the line that he was about to launch. And what he wanted me to write about was Carnival of Souls, the Herc Harvey film from 1962, which I immediately said yes to. But I said, I'd rather write about another film first. And that other film was The Brood. Because, in talking about The Brood, I also am able to talk about horror as a language. I was able to talk about why horror as a genre is more important to me than any other genre. I mean, it really was a vehicle for communicating on many levels. And I also felt I had a personal connection to the film through surviving and helping my family survive what we were dealing with at the time I first saw the film, where we were dealing with our own trauma and post-trauma as adults. And Neil said, sure. So I had written a short article on my blog. I used to have a blog called My Rant that I contributed to daily and then later in the life of the blog weekly. And I'd written about The Brood one October. When you're blogging, Halloween season, what's your favorite horror movie? So I wrote about The Brood. And I took that article and I expanded it slightly for my friend Tim Paxton's online zine, print on demand zine called Monster. And I sent that piece to Neil and said, well, this is the seed of what I want to build on. And Neil encouraged me to build. And it's really dangerous to tell me to keep going. And you see the results, my friends. But Neil was very encouraging. I mean, I would turn in chapters and say, this is getting big. And Neil was like, this is great, Steve, keep going. And, I also found myself detailing Cronenberg's history. One film none of us have mentioned yet is Scanners, which fits right in the middle of all of this, And Scanners was Cronenberg's breakthrough film commercially. That was his first big hit. And that was a real hit when it came out in America, in the UK, in Australia, around the world. Scanners was a real breakthrough film for him. And I also was able to write about the evolution of the Canadian cinema, which, I grew up in Northern Vermont. Once I had a license at age 16, which was 1971, I used to drive up to Montreal to go to the movies. And I subscribed to Take One magazine, which was this terrific Canadian film magazine, one of the best film magazines ever. So I felt this real affinity for Canadian cinema, and I had experienced Canadian cinema in a way differently than most of my American fellows had, because I had access to it through 3 Canadian TV stations, 2 in English, 1 in French, growing up, and then being able to actually drive up to Montreal and see films that weren't going to play in America, never did play in America. So I wrote about that, and Neil just kept encouraging me, Lindsay. He didn't turn off the tap until I went, I think I'm done. And when they clocked it, it took the art director at PS Publishing, Michael. It took Michael like 2.5, almost 3 years to design the book. It was a real monster for him. Part of it being I'm addicted to using footnotes as communicative tools. There's a lot of information in the footnotes in anything I write, and some editors just put a kibosh on that. No footnotes. But Neil was like, no, keep it coming. And it grew into a 700-page book on The Brood. And for me, it was the most ambitious writing project I'd ever undertaken. I spent 2.5 years on the book. It was 5 years before it saw print. And right now I'm working on a revision for a paperback edition that PS Publishing is planning for later this year or early next year. I'm adding to it, if you can believe it. Because I was able to go back and watch Cronenberg's first film, Transfer. Have you ever seen Transfer? His first film?
Oh, is it not? We've got a Blu-ray that has Stereo and Crimes of the Future, but it has, I'm pretty sure it has Transfer.
I think it has Transfer on it. Yeah. That's where I have it as well.
Is it set is it in color and in the snow?
Yeah, that's it. They're in the middle of a field. They're in the middle of a field, and it's about a patient and his therapist, and they're fractious, and it's played out like a college level Samuel Beckett or Ionesco Theater of the Absurd sort of dialogue. But I backtrack to Transfer because there's the foundational basis for The Brood. The Brood's all about therapists and therapy. Not all about, but that's the narrative fuel for The Brood. So I've gone back to Transfer and write about its importance to The Brood. And there's some more recent films I hadn't seen before that echo aspects of The Brood, some of which I didn't even know existed when I was doing the book, which is probably a good thing because it would have been longer.
But one of the things about reading the book is that I'm currently working on a book about Australian horror cinema. And one of the things that really struck me was that the way the Canadian film industry was working with the tax shelters was exactly what happened with Australia in the 1980s, that you would kind of get, it was almost seen as the tax kind of write-off or as what they say in Australia, a rort.
And it also shaped, we experienced the Australian film renaissance here in America very dramatically with the import of everything from Peter Weir's early films to Breaker Morant being one of the big breakthrough hits in America. The big difference is a lot of us think of Canadian cinema as, autumn and snow. What we don't think about is, well, that's because that's when the tax break dollars were available, right? Like the money wouldn't flow until the dentists and doctors that needed the tax break were preparing their income taxes. And that meant the money would be available in November, which is cold and snowy and, late autumn in Canada, which means a lot of us associated Cronenberg with these landscapes that had more to do with when the money was available than any sort of interior vision he might have had as an artist. And I'm sure the same applies to Australian cinema, that whenever the money was available, and whatever locations were available. And we tended to get the more extreme Australian films, just like we tended to get the more extreme Canadian films. We didn't see Smash Palace. We saw Road Warrior. And then it wasn't until VHS that we got to see a lot of the Everett DeRoche produced films. And I love that stuff, Harlequin and just brilliant stuff. And even the stuff that wasn't necessarily brilliant, like Thirst, are fascinating genre films. There's a lot of stuff to dig in there. And we even got to see, it was funny how once VHS hit, because Peter Weir had made a splash as a Hollywood director, suddenly The Plumber, which was made for TV in Australia, was available on tape here. And I think The Plumber is a great piece of work, the whole tax shelter aspect of the Canadian film industry. And let's not forget, for both your history with Australian film and Canada's history with film, that echoes what was going on in the UK from the 30s to the 50s with the quota films, right? A certain number of British films had to play in British theaters. And so Hollywood would trickle money in so that small British studios could make very inexpensive programmers that would fill 60 minutes of time so it could accompany the Hollywood film that Paramount really wanted to bring into England and so on. So that whole quota quickie, definitely shaped what was going to happen later with Canada and Australia with how films were being bankrolled. The government stepped in because there wouldn't have been really a viable film industry without some means of feeding the industry geographically.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, you get that kind of push-pull between the investment and the kind of government-funded schemes. And it's interesting, Cronenberg kind of was recipient of both of those. And of course, there was the whole controversy with Shivers about your taxpayers' money, but yet he was the only one, I think, whose films actually made money for the taxpayer.
That's the fact. It was the only profitable Canadian commercial feature that had been made up to that point. The only one that had brought in dollars from overseas. He wasn't able to make Rabid for 2 years because he was a pariah. But finally, somebody saw sense like, well, this is the only guy who's made us money. Let's let him do it again, even though that was a real Faustian pact that they were making. Cronenberg was smart in that, even with Fast Company, he only made the movies he wanted to make, which is remarkable when you think about the size of the industry he was working with, the antagonism that he felt right out of the gate with Shivers. I can't think of a Cronenberg film, whether you two and I liked it or not, that wasn't a film he wanted to make. I can't think of one film where it's like, nope, that's not a film David would have done. I mean, he loved race cars and he loved action movies, so Fast Company was right up his alley, But every other film and every film, including Fast Company, were films he wanted to make. I think the only place he compromised, which most people haven't seen, were some of those 1-hour dramas he did for CBC. There were a couple of them that are a little clumsy because you can tell he wasn't fully engaged. I mean, the only ghost story he ever told was one of those TV plays, The Lying Chair. And you can feel how uncomfortable he is with the material, that he's not really invested in it because he doesn't believe in ghosts. He brings ghosts back later in some of his later films. I'm thinking about the Hollywood film with Robert Pattinson with
Master of the Stars.
Yes, yeah. And there's spectral figures in that, but Cronenberg he said it blatantly in interviews. He doesn't really believe in the supernatural, so that doesn't really play a role. Even in Dead Zone, the ESP is triggered by an accident, so it's it's another mutation rather than any sort of psychic ability per se.
But then he's also talked about like when he was working, he was kind of compelled to write The Brood. That, it was obviously a response to what was the breakup of his marriage and so on. And so there is this famous quote where he says that he feels like this film is a more realistic version of Kramer versus Kramer. So he's taking kind of these elements of his life. And he also says it's very, very autobiographical film. But yet he's also fusing it with these genre elements. I guess it's going back to what we were talking about before. Like, how is this use of genre elements, do you think, making this film a more realistic depiction?
Oh, that's a great question, Lindsay. I think part of it is let's say he had done The Brood, not with psychoplasmics, but rooted it in something like what he was actually dealing with in his life. Okay. Now, I've never found anywhere the name of the California retreat that his first wife wanted to take their daughter to, but it was something like the Esalen Institute, which is usually called Esalen. And it was a nonprofit retreat center revolving around the use of meditation and new age techniques and so on to personal enlightenment. But there was a lot of controversy around the Esalen Institute because it also involved a sexual component. And that's part of what Cronenberg was very uncomfortable with. Like, what are these adults doing in this retreat? That's their business. But if you bring a child into it, then what? And we had our own controversy here in the state of Vermont with a retreat called Island Pond that the police ultimately raided back in the 70s or very early 80s, I think the 70s, because there were children there and people were getting concerned. Like, what is this cult-like behavior? What's happening to these children? So let's say The Brood was not done around Dr. Raglan and psychoplasmics, but that he had done a more realistic narrative closer to this true life experience. Well, it would play very dated today. And part of the beauty of The Brood is it plays as potently now as it did in 1979, in part because that imaginative element pulls it out of that time zone of the late 70s, early 80s that was actually feeding the conflict in Cronenberg's life. We could look back on, there were a number of films that came out about cult deprogramming and people being pulled into the Moonies. there was one film with James Woods, as a matter of fact.
Split Image.
Right, exactly, playing a
Yeah.
deprogrammer. Those films are still worth revisiting, but they're dated. The Brood doesn't feel dated at all. So one aspect of working with the genre is when you are talking about the times you live in, but you're using science fiction / horror to present a metaphoric version of the time you live in many cases that outlives the time period in which the film was made. And I'm thinking of very un-Cronenberg-like films like Edgar Ulmer's The Raven from the early 1930s. You know, it's set between World War I and World War II, but the whole idea of the satanic cult in this Art Deco, palace that's been built on a war graveyard, that resonates as powerfully today as ever it did. Or to go to seedier cinema, a lot of those Jess Franco movies that involved rich men with their Isle estates of, white slavery and sexual malpractice. Well, those play pretty true to life now that we're in the Jeffrey Epstein era,
Sure.
They don't feel so fantastic any longer. So I think there's a verisimilitude to working with imaginative genre elements to reconfigure whatever it is in your contemporary landscape that's informing the story you're telling. And by removing those real world reference points, you're giving yourself the freedom to create this invented universe that may read, play, feel as vital 30, 40, 50 years later as it did when it was being made. And I think The Brood is a demonstration of that. I think it also allows you to go deeper, Lindsay, like the whole idea of psychoplasmics, the body being used as the landscape for the emotional turmoil that is driving someone to therapy in the first place. Once it's physically manifest, which is right in David Cronenberg's ballpark, I mean, that's his wheelhouse, choose your term. It lends an urgency to it. And he knew that. I love how the opening of The Brood is echoed in Scanners with the demonstration of the telekinetic ability that leads to that head detonation meme that we see everywhere on social media these days. Well, not so much these days, but 10 years ago, it was everywhere. And, he understood the power of that physical expression of the internal emotions manifesting itself biologically. And first we get it with Mike, with the little blisters and the little drops of blood. But all that is to set us up for Nola, spreading her gown and saying, well, look, and you buy it when it happens, because as a storyteller, he's planted every seed along the way, including Robert Silverman's amazing, pulling down his collar, going, I've got a revolution on my hands. And he's showing those cancer manifestations on his throat. So, yeah, I think it renders it timeless, or can render it timeless.
And I think it just takes you just more into the experience rather than observing it, you're feeling it. So I think again of like David Lynch, because I wrote a book on Firewalk with Me, and I talked about how, so many survivors of abuse said to David Lynch and Cheryl Lee that film more accurately depicts, with its all, I guess, somewhat fantastical elements, or the fact you've got this kind of monstrous figure, that it was felt that it was more accurately expressing what they were going through. And like Eraserhead is basically, it always seems like it's the fear of being a father.
Yeah, it definitely is the fear of having a child. Definitely.
Yeah, you've got this being home, and like, what if it gets sick? And so it's the kind of the worst nightmare scenario. And then I think I struggle with anxiety. I get like anxiety hives, and it's awful because it's like you can't stop it, and it's making the situation worse. And you can't do any, I mean, you can do lots of deep breathing and things, but
your body is now you've already triggered what your body's going to do.
And like the more you're aware of it, the worse it gets. And it's just, it's just hard. And you have no control over it. And it just makes you feel,
Okay. Now for your listeners, I am not brown nosing here. After you and I got to talk with our good friend on Cradle to the Grave, I went and bought your Twin Peaks book, and it was terrific. And you just paraphrased the part of the book that rang very true for me. For about a decade, I edited, published, and co-published a comics anthology called Taboo. And the whole premise of Taboo was we wanted to collect the most disturbing comics anyone was doing anywhere in the world between our covers. And some issues, I think we came close. One of the works that was contributed to Taboo was by a creator named Leslie Black. And she brought us, through a mutual friend, Mitch Berger, a complete graphic novel she had done called Things Happen. And this was Leslie struggling with her memories of having been abused as a child. And everything you said in your Twin Peaks book about how the kinetics and the imaginative elements of Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me communicated more vividly than any other film I've ever seen, an experiential approach to surviving, well, and Laura doesn't really survive the abuse that she suffers, is absolutely true of Leslie's graphic novel, Things Happen. Before we got to publish it, Leslie decided she wanted to self-publish it, so we let her keep the money we had paid. We used to pay $100 a page, and we said, just keep it and use it to bankroll your book. And she did self-publish Things Happen. I only have one copy. It's hard to find these days because it was a small print run. But everything you said was true of that. And that work was presented to us in, I want to say 1990, 90 or 91. It was right around then when we were going to publish it. So you're really onto something. And I think the same is true of The Brood. I think The Brood, Cronenberg presents a case history in a single film. And I made mention of this earlier in our conversation. I'm surprised how many things I've read about The Brood where the people take at face value that Nola's mother was abusive to her. But we don't know that. In fact, the mother is drinking. And, Marge said to me last night, well, a drinking mother. And I said, we don't know if she started drinking because Nola kept ending up in the hospital. And the only thing she tells Candy, her granddaughter, is your mother used to get these bumps. And we see at the end of the film, it's manifesting on the daughter because she has now been through this horrible traumatic event, unfathomably traumatic event that doesn't involve sexual abuse, but it certainly involves a truly horrific case of domestic abuse. So we don't know what this family's history is. And the other thing I found interesting in revisiting The Brood, and this is one of the things I'm adding for the revised paperback edition that's being put together. I had never seen the American TV soap opera Peyton Place, right? I was too young. I wasn't allowed to watch Peyton Place when it was on TV, right? My mom wouldn't let me watch it, but she'd go watch it, The character who plays Nola's father plays an abusive father in Peyton Place. And that narrative arc colored, Peyton Place as a soap opera had like 20, narrative threads running through every episode. But one of the strongest ones in the first season involves that actor playing an alcoholic, abusive father. And the abuse is leaning towards sexual abuse, but American TV at that time couldn't go there. But it does make me wonder when I revisit the film, like, is that part of why he was cast? Because to Cronenberg and to his casting director, Peyton Place would have been pretty fresh in their memories, right? That played everywhere around the world when it was popular in the 60s. So we don't really know. We know what Nola says to us, but we don't know how much of it's true. And having been through knowing people who were going through intense therapy, you had to take what you were told as true because it was true to those survivors. But often you'd find out later that they either reconciled or, had a different kind of awakening, that whatever you had been told before was not the case. And that colors my revisiting The Brood. We don't know what Nola's childhood was. And Nola, we can clearly see in the film, is an intense personality. And I'm downplaying, a description there. Samantha Eggert gives just a powerhouse performance. And we're also not given, we're the only access we're giving, the only window we're given to the past are those photographs that are spread out on the couch when Candy's with her grandmother. And the only one we really see is that photo of Nola as a child in bed, played by the same actress who's playing Candy, and her mother, Candy's grandmother. And all we know is what the grandmother says. Oh, your mother used to get these bumps on her and we couldn't explain them. And that was triggered by you describing having hives when you get anxious, you know? So we don't know what that family's life is like. We don't know what the dynamic was between Frank and Nola before all this crazy stuff is going on. We get little glimpses of it. You know, Frank brings the police up to Nola's apartment. He says, I'd never been here before. Nola and Candy lived here for 6 months. We're seeing it for the first time that he's seeing it. There's photographs of Carl Jung and Freud on the wall, along with Raglan. We're getting a lot of backstory just from environment, but we don't know how much of it's reliable and unreliable. We don't know what's true and what isn't true. And that really rings powerfully for me in The Brood. And it troubles me when so many people present fait accompli. Oh, we're told this, so this must be the reality of it, right? The mother is the abuser. Nola is the victim. We don't know that, we don't know that. And it's that ambiguity, I think, that also lends to the richness of the film that has me coming back to it again and again as an adult.
Well, it feels like I was watching it again and having, written the book about Firework with me, is I kind of felt like Juliana, the grandmother, her behavior was similar to me, like to Sarah Palmer, who smokes compulsively. And Juliana is obviously drinking a lot. And it almost, and I have read some things that were positing that maybe the father was the abuser because she has the anger against the father. It does seem like something happened in that family.
Yes. Oh, something definitely happened. I'm not saying it didn't, but we don't know what it is. And I agree with you. The only physical violence that Nola ever expresses is when she's beating on Raglan, when he's role playing the father. And it's like, that's a way more visceral reaction direct from Nola than any reaction to her mother that we've seen. Now, of course, The Brood is the most violent expression of what's going on inside of Nola. But we also see in the film that she lashes out against a complete innocent. The teacher is killed just because of Nola's suspicions. If you've ever dealt with a narcissistic personality, man, that's classic behavior right there, right? If you try to set boundaries for a narcissist, you are setting yourself up for attack because that's how they have to realign their reality, making themselves the victim, you the antagonist. And we see Nola do that with Candace's teacher.
That leads me to my thought about psychoplasmics itself. And I think with Raglan, what he's trying to do is find that the root of her trauma by doing these role-playing sessions. And the idea is that the trauma can manifest itself physically. And maybe that's once the manifestation happens, that's where they realize where they've hit on sort of the source of that. But what he doesn't expect is that Nola's going to start giving birth to these creatures that are going to then attack the people that in the crosshairs, as it were, of her anger or her trauma. And so I guess that's why we never really know what happened, but these people are being turned into victims through this process. So yeah, I'm just wondering, what's your thoughts on the psychoplasmics process and how this kind of manifests with with these brood characters, which also we see that autopsy scene of how these things are manifest. So yeah, I'm just wondering what your thoughts on Raglan's whole process is there.
I think it's brilliant. I really do think it's brilliant. I mean, when you think about it, cinema in and of itself is a externalization of rage. In the case of action cinema, Westerns, I mean, we could name a number of genres where it's all about externalizing, internalized rage, cultural and individual, the country it's made in, the individual filmmakers. So in a way, it's a perfect metaphor for what cinema is and how cinema works, right? Nobody responds to a movie that's important to them if they're dispassionate about it, right? So if movies have plugged into some aspect of our own hardwiring, then it becomes important to us. All three of us could offer a case history in that, with whatever films we might name were really important to us as formative work. Psychoplasmics also is a perfect evolution from the previous David Cronenberg films, right? Now I'm including Stereo and the first Crimes of the Future, where we're shown examples of mutation, right? We're shown, I believe it's Stereo that has the telepath who's drilled the hole in his forehead, which Cronenberg reinvents in Scanners for Michael Ironside's character of Revok. We're shown in Crimes of the Future that these cosmetic mutations from Rouge Malady are actually creating strange organs growing out of someone's nostrils. And they're trying to figure out, what are these tendrils? What do they do? Then with Shivers, it's this externalized influence, the parasites that are put into a human body and alter the human body behavior, just the way that certain funguses alter the behavior of ants, certain wasp stings and eggs will alter the behavior of cockroaches, and so on. Then with Rabid, Cronenberg introduces a radical form of plastic surgery. It's not explained in the film, and much to his regret in interviews, he's expressed his regret that he cut the one piece of dialogue that explained what happened, which was because it was a morphologically neutral flesh transplant to Rose's body after she was almost killed in a motorcycle accident. The transplants work because they render the flesh that's going to be grafted neutral. And yet this neutral field on the body is merging with Rose's body when she's being kept alive by intravenous feeding, which is why this new organ grows inside of her, right? It's trying to replicate feeding intravenously because that's what the tissue learned feeding was. And then once Rose wakes up and it's healed enough that she's ambulatory and autonomous, now she's driven by this new organism she's become. She's become a vampire, essentially, just very different from every other vampire ever in cinema or literary history. With The Brood and Psychoplasmics, to answer your question, Liam, he's taken it the next step where Raglan is as a therapist, classic therapy, where it's like role playing. He's not giving them any chemicals. We're never, nothing's ever mentioned about injections or, there's no external chemical or transformative element. It's all what's inside the individual that Raglan is coaxing out and having them externalized on their bodies, with their bodies. So this is the first Cronenberg film where it's all an expression of whatever's inside the characters that is taking on these more and more visible. And by the end of the film, when we discover what's been going on with Nola, these more and more aggressive new forms of body as self-expression. And then that's where Cronenberg goes. Scanners is all about that. Although in Scanners, there is the whole element of, a birth, a drug that was given pregnant mothers that caused the mutation. With Videodrome, the mutation is caused by externalized stimulus created using the Videodrome signal. So he goes back to, mad science, which is why I consider The Brood the more mature work, because it stands out in that continuity of films as being, now it's really about, if these characters fully express themselves, how far does it go? Raglan says it again and again, go through it all the way, come out the other side. I mean, we hear that line 2-3 times in the film, and Cronenberg's doing that with his screenplay. He's going all the way. We're going to come out the other side, and we're not ready for where it goes. The other aspect of Psychoplasmics is there is a positive potential there. Let's say that Nola had been a blissful, balanced individual. What children would she have given birth to? It would have been a very, very different movie. But that's not what Cronenberg was about at this time. He was dealing with externalizing his own rage toward his life situation. And he was also externalizing his fear for his own child, and which really is what The Brood is about, right? A parent's fear for their own child. What if the other parent becomes dangerous? And that's really what the film is about. And if we remove gender, male, female. We've seen plenty of films on the Lifetime network, week after week after week, where it's the male who's the dangerous member of the couple. And I bring that up because I feel like our entire pop culture is in this constant dialogue. And depending on what you're watching or what you're looking to, there are just as many female filmmakers who have been exploring this in their own work as Cronenberg was with The Brood. It's part of the reason when, accusations of misogyny are brought up. I mean, I could point to 50 films where I could go, well, misandry, it's like, this is all about how no male is trustworthy. And we've all seen films like that, including, Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, where almost every male character is either passive or is victimizing Laura and her circle of teenage friends. But that's what the film's about. So with Psychoplasmics, I think on multiple levels, it really works. In my book on The Brood, I also go back into the predecessors, forgotten films like Night Monster from 1942, where a man is able to, by force of his will alone, regenerate new limbs so that he can exact revenge. And after each killing, the limbs retract into his body. They dissolve because it's not true flesh. It's externalized flesh that has a limited lifespan. For a 1942 movie coming out of a major studio like Universal, that's pretty gonzo stuff, It's not until William Burroughs that we find stuff like that later on. And I think once we get to the more interesting Cronenberg's films after his hardcore genre films like Naked Lunch, it gets really interesting because then, Psychoplasmics has turned into, talking insect typewriters and all sorts of bizarre creatures.
But I think, this idea, we're talking about the misogyny accusations that Cronenberg has kind of always dealt with throughout his career.
Yes.
It's interesting, I think in many ways, the whole idea of a gender binary is something that is broken down throughout his work. I also
agree.
feel like, I personally have really, really loved Cronenberg's work. And the experience of being a woman, I know what it's like to kind of feel like your body's always out of control. And you're kind of, in many ways, a lot of the time, kind of fighting the forces of like, if you don't want to have a child, that's, something you always have to kind of almost fight against nature in some respect. I also think about like a lot of recent films and filmmakers who are, I was listening to an interview with Cronenberg where he was talking about Julia Ducournau and Caroline Fargeau and how he's like, I've got these like cinematic daughters.
Yes, exactly.
He has so many female fans, and I think the people who are kind of continuing his legacy in cinema now are primarily female filmmakers. There's always these accusations of misogyny. Just as a horror fan, I get asked all the time, like, why do you like horror films? How could you possibly? They're all about women being murdered. And it's like, well, no.
No, they're not. And as a matter of fact, it's interesting when you bring that up, Lindsay, because the mainstream horror films that nobody calls horror films, I've been collecting movie ads from the 40s, and there was people always talk about horror. Horror stopped in the 40s with Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. You can buy into that if you forget that actresses like Joan Fontaine's entire careers were starring in Gothics, period Gothics and contemporary set Gothics in the 40s, like Notorious, where she's the victim, or the threatened. The whole nature of Gothic, Jane Eyre, the Bronte sisters, involves usually female protagonists who are placing themselves in jeopardy by falling for the wrong man or being pushed by cultural forces, right? The only way women could have land was to marry a rich older man, and the horrible relationships they find themselves in. Those are all horror films to me, but I've had a lifetime too of the same diet, only as a male being told, why are you watching this completely sick shit? And to me, it's like, well, actually, this stuff deals with that much more directly than the dramas and the comedies you're watching. So say what you will, or attack me as you will. I think part of it is, and I did tangle with this in the book, I think part of it is a form of blinders. I wasn't going after Robin Wood. And in fact, I reached out to one of his students and successors, Tony Williams, and I ran the entire manuscript past Tony because I did not want to be. Robin Wood's work was very important to me. I read his book, his writings growing up, and Robin Wood was one of the people who taught me what writing about cinema could be, right? And he's still one of the most articulate autopsy artists of cinema that ever put pen to paper or finger on typewriter keys. But he seemed to have a real blind spot with Cronenberg. I think part of it was he was in love with this progressive, what he saw as a very progressive phase of 1970s horror films. And there were certain filmmakers where he was right in sync with them. Larry Cohen, George Romero, to a lesser extent, John Carpenter. And John Carpenter is a very conservative filmmaker. I mean, Carpenter is very clear. He's quite conservative in his life. But even he had his fill with Reaganomics and Made They Live, which is, the most explicit attack on Reaganomics in 90s mainstream film. But Robin seemed to resent Cronenberg's films, which I find fascinating in and of itself. And I think I put my finger on it when I identified that what Wood was about was humanism, right? He was attracted to horror films that were using the language of the genre to talk about the human component. And Cronenberg wasn't interested much at all in that. And I think that was in and of itself appalling to Robin. I've said earlier in our conversation, Shivers was from the point of view of the parasite. And I'm not saying that. Cronenberg said that at the time. Right? He found the parasites they were sort of the heroes of the film. They win at the end. They've infected everybody who's driving out of the complex in their cars to go and spread the wonders of being infected with a sexual parasite. In Rabid, Rose's whole life is upended because she's become this new organism, and the film is really about this new organism. I think all of this was antithetical to what drove Robin Williams. He wrote a lovely book on Ingmar Bergman's films. And in the final chapter of both one of his Bergman books and his book on Hitchcock's films, the revised edition that he did, he begins by writing very candidly about, I'm sitting in my study and I'm looking out at my window at my children playing. Robin was trying to connect the cinema life that he was internalizing to the life he wanted to live. And during that, he came out as a gay man. He left his family. He taught in Canada for a time, became an expatriate. And he was always very candid about this in his writings about film. And I think Cronenberg was just inherently and aesthetically antithetical to everything Robin Wood was interested in with the 1970s horror films. He could even make sense of Tobe Hooper and Kim Henkel's Texas Chainsaw Massacre fitting snugly because it was an attack on capitalist culture, how capitalism strips humans of all agency until you're reduced to cannibals feeding on meat. And you don't even see, victims as potential sexual victims because you're more primal than even the sexual drive. They're food or they're not food. Robin was all with that. That fit into his schemata. And I think Cronenberg was just too radical a divergent. And in my book, I argue, Robin attacked Cronenberg for not being relevant, not understanding his culture. And I spend a whole chapter outlining the scandals that broke in Canada involving Catholic orphanages and medical institutions that were caught experimenting on children. And I look at The Brood and I go, this is the one film that really goes there, right? It metaphorically, we've talked about how it deals with therapy and things like the Esalen retreat, but it's also the first Canadian film to push back against these mounting scandals that were beginning to be unveiled in the mid to late 70s and then really broke through into mainstream newspaper media and international media by the 80s and especially the 90s about what was going on in these institutions that were supposed to be protecting children. And they were abusing children. They were even killing and burying children on their grounds. So I look at this and say, well, to me, Cronenberg was more engaged with what was actually happening in the Canadian culture than any other filmmaker. It's only later that we begin to see usually made for TV films that were about either these Catholic orphanages and the kind of sexual abuse that was exposed in the 90s, or films about these backwoods religious cults. There's been a couple of really good ones that were forming alternative communities, but using them to set up another patriarchal culture where they're going to abuse the women and the children. The Brood went there before any of them did.
It's like what we were saying before about how genre can address these things indirectly and can explore them through these elements that a film that would be directly addressing it, which would come out later, obviously, but couldn't do that, could it, in the same way?
I also think because they're not engaging with case histories per se, the emotional through line is more vivid and immediate for us. Just as you wrote in your book about Fire Walk with Me, Lindsay, you experience it more on a more immediate level, including the fragmenting of your reality, the fragmenting of, what's dream, what's real, the way that Fire Walks with Me confronts that Bob is this projection, or potentially this projection that keeps Laura from recognizing it's her father who's coming into her bedroom at night, right? Bob is like the id projection of the evil that's being perpetrated on her, and it allows her to not see it's her father. I think The Brood does that too, because we're feeling on this really vivid emotional level the feelings that are involved with this little mini apocalypse this family is going through. And, it includes some beautiful grace notes. I still love how in the third act, our whole perspective on Raglan changes outside of that shack. Like we finally realize, oh, this guy's trying to do the right thing. Like we don't know until that point. Is he the mad scientist in this Cronenberg science fiction tale? And it's not until he levels with Frank and somehow gets Frank to understand enough of what's going on that Frank tries to go in and keep Nola calm, but he loses his shit once she opens up her gown. It's like, oh my God, this is beyond human comprehension. And that change in Raglan, I don't remember any Cronenberg character before that having that many dimensions to them. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Because he sends all the patients home, doesn't he? Or sends them away because he understands what's happened and that he can't guarantee their safety anymore, right? He's got to isolate Nola because he's realized what he's done in a way. He is sort of the mad scientist in a way, but recognizes the monster that he's created in his process.
And he's also recognizing this is out of my control.
Yeah.
Like I've lost control. The minute he looks up, we don't know the first time we see the film what's going on. When he looks up and sees the broken window, rewatching the film, you realize that's when Raglan knows, oh my God, this is out of control.
Yeah.
And I love that newspaper that we get a glimpse of. Police seek killer dwarves, which is funny. But it's also the moment where, Raglan sees that and he knows like, okay, I've got to get everybody off this campus because they're not safe. And Nola has gone, this experiment has completely spilled out of my control.
Yeah.
Because until that point, I thought he was kind of almost a narcissist or this cult leader. Like it opens with the scene with Mike and there's someone in the audience going, oh, he's a genius. Yeah. And it almost seems like the way he walks around in that short bathrobe and things, and he's got this compound and this henchman almost, doing his bidding. And it always seemed like it was always just about him. The fact that you've got Mike when he is kind of cast out and he says to Frank and Jan, he's like, I'm addicted to him. I need him. And he wants someone to be his daddy. And so it's almost like he is like a cult leader. He's created these people that almost can't exist without him.
Exactly. And Oliver Reed plays it just the way you're receiving it. I mean, I love that scene with Frank where he's got the bathrobe on and he's like massaging his neck. And, while Frank is trying to get his attention, he's like touching up his hair in the mirror, like very narcissistic behavior. Like, and then we find out he's trying to do the right thing by the end of the film, after all we've seen is this arrogant patriarch, really.
And I think another reason why, it makes, I guess, so many people uncomfortable. I mean, you've talked about, Robin Wood's perspective on Cronenberg's work. And then I also, you also do mention, and it's someone, and a theory I've taught a lot is Barbara Creed's Monstrous Feminine. And she has the whole chapter on the brood as the monstrous womb. Her whole thesis about the monstrous feminine is, that women, especially women's maternal function, is always presented as abject and disgusting. And it's part of this, expression of patriarchal misogyny of trying to, I guess, oppress women because they can create life. Well, we've got to make that into something disgusting and something that needs to be kind of, repressed. And in some ways, you could say The Brood is kind of a textbook example of that, if you're only looking at it through that lens, that you have this woman who literally has this monstrous, disgusting womb, and at the end, she must be killed. And film is also maybe positing that it's being passed from mother to daughter through the generations. But I don't know, it just seems like it makes sense what her argument is, but it's missing just, the nuances of it.
I don't think it's just the nuances, Lindsay. I think it's also, I always try to keep in mind what is the scope of the cultural conversation that this is part of. Okay, now the same year that The Brood came out, we got the most hideous phallic monster in mainstream studio filmmaking in Alien. I mean, that thing is a cock on leg, period, right? And it's a ravenous, all-devouring cock on legs that, like Nola, is able to apparently procreate without needing a sexual partner of any kind, right? Through the cocooning process that we didn't see in the theatrical cut. But when we got the Ridley Scott restored version, we actually see the captain character in the cocoon phase, where this creature is able to procreate without, asexually. So I look at that broader cultural dialogue, and I say, and I also have to say, I've read and I admire and I feed on Barbara Creed's book in a lot of ways. But I also have to go, but that's the year of Alien. And Alien was a way more successful film. Way more people saw it than The Brood. Does that mean that the fear of patriarchal and phallic power is more omnipresent in our culture than the misogynist dread of the female womb? I mean, almost all movie monsters are penises on legs, if you want to go there. Except for the female ones, which bring the other side. And I think a lot of my fascination with that genre is that swinging pendulum. I don't want to go back to David Lynch. I'll choose a different example. I just got to watch Mondo Macabre, the label Mondo Macabre that does those wonderful Blu-rays and DVDs, just released the first gorgeous transfer we've ever had of this fairly obscure Spanish-made horror film called Island of the Doomed. It also played as Maneater from Hydra, and it's Cameron Mitchell as this mad scientist on this Spanish island, and he's bred this vampire tree. And at the end of the film, when we finally see the vampire tree in all its glory, it's these tentacle branches that have flowers that open, and there are these penises that come out of the flowers, right, which are part of flower botanical anatomical structures, stamens, and so on. But they look like penises spouting blood. That's what they look like. And in fact, when we see them in operation on a victim, they look exactly like the penile organ in Rose's armpit in Rabbit. Like those two, if you put those two images together, if you showed your students without telling them what the film was, here's a clip from Island of the Doomed of a feeding scene. Now let's look at a feeding scene from Rabid. The student would go, are these the same movie? They look like the same thing. And by the end of the film, Cameron Mitchell is embracing his vampire tree because the hero has taken an axe to it. And he's calling it my children, my love. And there's close-ups of, it's clearly not Cameron Mitchell's hands because it's not a big beefy man hand. It's a more graceful hand. So somebody else was doing the special effects, and they're holding these blood hemorrhaging penises that are coming out of the flowers. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, oh my God, for 1967, here's a film that was completely under the radar. I'd only read about it in obscure zines and journals and barely played theatrically in America. And when you see it restored, it's like, oh my God, this is like Videodrome or something. I mean, this is what Tim Lucas described being on the set of Videodrome when the packages arrived from Rick Baker's makeup studio of the planned orgy that they were going to shoot for the end of the film with all these new sexual organs. And the whole cast and crew were playing with them, and they were like these completely bizarre extrapolations on vaginal and penile organs. And I thought of that as I was watching the end of Island of the Doomed, like, this must be sort of what those Rick Baker things look like. Now, why am I going on and on and on about this? Because I look at The Brood in the context of the broader pop culture of the time. And your paper accurately cited, Lindsay, Cronenberg picked the biggest target when he was being interviewed about The Brood, which was Kramer versus Kramer. And he went, I'm being more honest than Kramer versus Kramer. I look at the year 1979 and I go, well, then The Brood was the answer or the antithesis or the animus of, or the anima of the, of Alien, where it was H.R. Giger's design of the sexualized monstrosities, where it was an entirely a male force. So it doesn't justify either in a way. But we don't need justification because we love this genre, and we're all drawn to these bizarre excesses of imagery because it speaks to us so clearly. And we're also drawn to it because this is really original stuff. I mean, when The Brood came out, there was nothing else like The Brood. As you noted in your conversation, a lot of the filmmakers who are building on Cronenberg are female filmmakers. And I love the film his daughter made, Humane, which I luckily got to see in a theater, and it's about to finally legally come out on disc. So now we're enjoying the literal offspring of Cronenberg between his son. My favorite of his son's films is Possessor. I think that's an incredible movie myself.
We did an episode about it.
And Humane, which is terrific as well. And that's from his daughter. I'm interested to see where they're going to go. I hope I live long enough to see as many films by them as their father made. And I have no doubt that they're going to explore territory none of the three of us can even imagine at this point in time.
We should move on to The Fly.
Yeah.
Should we go on to The Fly?
Yeah. We beat The Brood to death here.
Yes.
So.
I think you're making a mistake. I think you really want to talk to me.
Sorry, I have 3 other interviews to do before this party's over.
Yeah, but they're not working on something that'll change the world as we know it.
They say they are.
Yeah, but they're lying.
There is a limit, even to the imagination.
Human teleportation, molecular decimation, breakdown, and reformation is inherently purging.
Where our greatest creations meet our deepest fears.
Something went wrong, Seth. When you went through, something went wrong.
You are about to go beyond that limit.
Those weird hairs that were growing out of your back, I had them analyzed. But they were definitely not human. If you saw how scared and angry and desperate he is.
I'm sure Typhoid Mary was a very nice person, too, when you saw her socially.
No!
You're afraid to be destroyed and recreated, aren't you?
You're changing, Seth. Everything about you is changing.
Oh, no. What's happening to me? Am I dying?
I want to know what's going on.
What does the disease want?
It wants to turn me into something else. Oh, no. A fly got into the transmitter pod with me that first time when I was alone. Don't go back to it. Could be contagious.
I'm afraid!
Don't be afraid!
No. Be afraid. Be very afraid.
Film opens with quirky, super nerdy scientist Seth Brundle chatting up freelance journalist Veronica Ronnie Quaife at a press event. Brundle convinces Ronnie to go back to his lab where he promises to prove to her a scientific breakthrough that will change the world. When they get there, Ronnie discovers this wasn't a pickup line, but that Brundle indeed has stumbled across something truly mind-blowing, teleportation. But it is only in its early stages, as he can only teleport inanimate objects. Brundle asks Ronnie not to publish this breakthrough, but rather chronicle his experiments towards developing the technology to teleport organic matter in exchange for exclusive publishing rights once he has achieved this milestone. Ronnie agrees, much to the chagrin of her publisher and former boyfriend, Stathis Borans. Brundle and Ronnie begin their professional relationship, which quickly turns romantic, with a test using a baboon in the telepods, which fails with grisly results. Brundle determines he needs to program the computer to quote-unquote love the flesh in order to make the telepods work. The next test is a success, with the baboon surviving the journey. Brundle and Ronnie get drunk while celebrating and get into a fight, which results in Ronnie storming off. Alone and intoxicated, Brundle decides to use the telepods himself and fails to notice a fly sneak into the telepod with him. Brundle quickly develops an increase in strength, agility, and sexuality, thinking this is an unforeseen side effect of teleportation. But then the physical transformation starts. First, strange bristly hairs form, then fingernails drop off, until eventually whole body parts deteriorate and his organic systems shift and break down, including his digestive system, meaning he now needs to vomit on his food in order to eat it. He eventually realizes the telepods fused him with the fly and he has become a new organism, a Brundle fly. He is now determined to re-splice himself with human DNA in the pods to try and return to normal. But when he learns that Ronnie is pregnant and trying to get an abortion out of fear of birthing a giant maggot, Brundlefly kidnaps her. He takes her back to the telepods in order to fuse them all together, himself, Ronnie, and the baby, into a single organism. Borans appears, shotgun in hand, and tries to save Ronnie, who battles Brundlefly, causing his final transformation into a giant monstrous fly. He manages to get Ronnie into one telepod and enters the other, and as they warm up for the splicing procedure, Boran shoots the power cables, cutting off Ronnie's pod. So Brundlefly instead merges with the telepod itself, turning him into yet another variation, a mix of organic and inorganic matter. Ronnie takes up the shotgun and levels it at Brundlefly, who grabs the barrel and points it at his own head. Even he knows he now must die. With tears in her eyes, Ronnie shoots Brundlefly, killing him.
I kind of feel like with these phases in Cronenberg's career that I feel like Scanners is kind of the end of the first phase. And then you go from like Videodrome 83, Dead Zone 84, The Fly 86, and kind of to Dead Ringers 88.
Yeah.
That seems like the next stage
I agree.
for him.
I agree. Yes.
What are some of the shifts that you see if we're kind of going into this second phase?
Well, one of them I pointed out is I see more proactive male characters. In fact, I would point to Scanners as the perfect transitional work because Jennifer O'Neill plays the most mature of the telepath community. Like she's the matriarch of this alternative, peace-loving group of telekinetics. And Revik is the renegade, more powerful patriarchal figure only because of his thirst for power and his access to money and technology that Jennifer O'Neill doesn't have. And Stephen Lack, and I've met him. I met him at a comics convention, and I've got a drawing he gave me because he's an artist, the actor who plays Revik's brother. If there is a more passive Cronenberg character, male character, I don't know what it would be. Because Stephen Lack, and I don't mean to be cruel by playing on his last name, his character's a blank slate, but he's intended to be, right? We're told later in the film that he was cut off from any normal upbringing, and now he's just been loosed into like Caspar Hauser into contemporary society, and he's on his own. So I feel like that's the transitional film where there's a powerful matriarch, Jennifer O'Neill, which I don't see many people writing about or focusing on as the character she really is in that film. I mean, she survives everything, and she's the one that the dueling brothers finally are vying over, not as a potential sexual partner, but in this power play between these mutants, this telekinetic new class. And then with, by the time we get to The Fly, I think Cronenberg has mastered his craft. I mean, it's essentially a 3-act, 3-hand drama. I mean, there are more than 3 characters, but the core characters, there's 3 actors listed at the beginning, and those are our focus. And those 3 characters are the propelling agent for this whole narrative, particularly Gina Davis and Jeff Goldblum. And Jamie Gertz gives a great performance. I'd only seen him in Blood Simple other than this by this time, the Coen brothers' first film, where he was a hapless stooge, essentially, right? The ultimate film noir victim who doesn't know what the hell is going on around him. I also think in this film, we're getting a more playful Cronenberg. I mean, the dialogue is really witty. It's really smart dialogue, but it's also smart dialogue in the style of almost a screwball romantic comedy at times, which is part of what is so disorienting when you're watching the film. But I think it's also part of why it was such a breakthrough hit. I mean, this was the biggest hit of Cronenberg's career, period. I don't think he ever had another film that went as big as this. The Fly was everywhere in 1986. And 20th Century Fox was having a bonanza between The Fly and James Cameron's Aliens. They were in theaters here in the States for months and months and months and months. And right when they were gone, they came back. You could go see them again. The other thing I think that's different about this film, and that also makes it a culmination of this phase of Cronenberg's period that this is in, is their likable characters. In Dead Ringers, there's not many likable characters in that film. And in Videodrome, we're looking at a pack of sociopaths in charge of media empires, including the one matriarch we meet, right? The daughter of the genius who founded Videodrome conceptually. And she's a pretty cold, aloof character, and she uses James Woods as much as anyone else in that film uses James Woods' character. She reprograms him, right? Woods is essentially the next blank slate after Stephen Lack's characters in Scanners. Goldblum is charming. Gina Davis is instantly likable. The chemistry between them feels true. Her world-wise ways, and the fact that she's coming out of an obviously abusive relationship. She goes home to her apartment and her boss is in the shower. Can't think of a more intrusive, element. It's also interesting to me, too, that Cronenberg calls back. Now, I'm not sure, the screenplay for The Fly was credited to Cronenberg and I don't want to mispronounce the name, Charles Edward Pogue. So I'm not sure who came up with it, but there's there's interesting callbacks, like Stathis, the boss, is able to be in her apartment because he still has the key to her apartment, even though they've broken up. And in The Brood, Nola's father can still get into the house, even though they've been divorced for 10 years, because he still has the key, right? There's certain callbacks here that I had never noticed before, but when you watch the two films back to back, it's like, oh, that's interesting. Okay. A writer, reusing a device in a different context. But I think that's the big change, is they're likable. And I think it was working on Dead Zone in his prior project where he warmed up to that aspect of it, because there aren't a lot of, for a mainstream audience, likable characters in the earlier Cronenberg films. The ones who are attractive, Robert Silverman is always a wonderful, eccentric presence in a film. He's the cancer victim in The Brood. He's the scanner artist in Scanners. I mean, those movies come alive when he's on screen, but not because he's likable. It's because he's such an eccentric presence. But in The Fly, man, I like everybody except Stathis. I mean, he is, and he turns out not to be the villain. Like, he actually saves Gina Davis's character in the final act against enormous odds. He's had his freaking hand and foot dissolved, and he's still,
which he kind of deserves that, though.
Does,
for his behavior.
He is still able to drag his ass in that shotgun over to disable the telepod before she's going to be put through the ringer. I also find it interesting that at the end of The Brood, it's all about the disintegration of the family, and yet in The Fly, the third act is all about Goldblum wants to physically merge father, lover, child into one entity. This is this crazy, final delusion that he acts on. And it's almost like Cronenberg going, okay, well, I played out the complete evaporation of a family unit. Now let's see how badly things can go if we have a character that wants to biologically merge us all into one. It's only later in a film like Richard Stanley's adaptation of Lovecraft's Color Out of Space where we see that again, right? The fusion in that farmhouse of mother and son into this hideous, being. So yeah, I think The Fly is just, and I remember the impact when it was out. I mean, I saw it in the theater. I was still with my first wife, Marlene, And I'll give you this little anecdote, not to derail our conversation. I had, Marlene asked me what are we going to go see tonight? So I picked out a number of movies, and after The Fly, she went, I'm picking the next movie. Right? And part of it was because every movie we went to had vomit in it. Right? So the next movie that opens, and Marlene says, we're going to see this opening weekend, Stand By Me.
Oh, God.
You know where I'm going with it. Yes. And it has the pie eating contest story in the middle of it. And I turned to her and went, I'm really glad you picked this movie. Right? It's like the most explosive vomit scene in 1986 cinema. Anyway,
Amazing.
The Fly was amazing when it first came out. I mean, we had just never seen anything like it.
Yeah, well, I just think going back to The Fly and the Brood comparisons, I think Brundle can be seen as a reverse Raglan, as we were saying. Like Raglan is someone who realizes that towards the end of what he's created and tries to do the right thing. But with Brundle, it kind of goes in the opposite direction, doesn't it? Where he kind of doubles down on the experiments and becomes the ultimate villain by the end.
I mean, it definitely feels like to me that, I mean, we're racing a bit ahead, but as he kind of fuses with the Fly, besides the physical transformation, his character completely changes. He becomes almost abusive to Veronica as he goes along. And it almost seems like that. And he says later on, insects are very, very brutal, no compromise, that you can't trust them. And then he talks about, wanting to be the first insect politician. It's interesting that the film begins at the point that they meet and then ends with his death. So we see their entire relationship. So the whole film is built around the relationship between the two of them. I was reading that the initial script by Charles Edward Pogue, the main characters were already married.
Oh, really? Yeah. So it went back to the original short story and film.
Yeah.
Yeah, but because I was thinking, because I haven't read the original short story, but thinking about the 1958 film, in that they're a married couple. So I thought maybe in the initial script it was playing with that. And then Cronenberg said that he read the script and felt that it was so much like him that it was unbelievable, but that he wanted to basically rewrite the whole script. And that the only thing he kept was the more scientific approach to the transformation. I don't know. Have you read the original short story? So in that, is it a married couple?
It's a married couple, and actually the 1958 film, Lindsay, is very close to the short story that George Langelin wrote. And the one big difference is in the short story, the creature that emerges from the telepod is a fusion of fly, cat, and human, right? It has a little cat nose that twitches and whiskers. So it's actually even more grotesque than what was in the first film, where it's a literal fly head on a human body and a fly hand, unlike any fly hand any fly ever had, as a matter of fact, the sort of claw. So, yeah, Cronenberg really altered. I mean, he made it his own completely, I think. I also think, when you lay out the trajectory of the narrative so succinctly, he's looking at the lifespan of an organism, which is the couple. He's not looking at the lifespan just of this new organism that Brundle becomes. He's looking at a couple as an organism. We meet them when they meet, and the film ends quite abruptly when it's done, when there's nothing left of Brundle at all, and except the baby that she still carries at that point. And I think that's also fits Cronenberg's trajectory, because Rabid was also about a couple as organism. The difference being the couple as organism failed the moment the motorcycle crashed. In fact, Rose never sees her boyfriend again in Rabid. If you think back to the film, I mean, he doesn't see her again after she leaves the hospital, and they're constantly frustrated by, they can't even talk to each other. He smashes a phone at one point because he's so frustrated. So I feel like The Fly is Cronenberg's passionate look rather than dispassionate look at an organism that is a couple, two people. and what happens with those two people. And then there's the third player, which, introduces so much of the conflict and dramatic elements to what happens to that couple. And it's a great romance film. I mean, part of the reason I think it was such a hit was, especially coming as it did on the cusp of the AIDS era, it really spoke to a generation and younger viewers as well as older viewers. It's funny how people that are closer to my age that rejected The Fly, but they went to see it. They paid their money. 20th Century Fox had got their coin. They would come out and just go, oh, it went too far. For a lot of people, the moment that Gina Davis grabs Jeff Goldblum's jaw and it breaks off, they're suddenly propelled out of the movie. Now we're in monster moviedom. And for those of us who love monster movies, we're like, yeah, it's going to go there, But it really is a pretty amazing love story in and of itself. It also, part of what it charts in a couple like that, and you're right, it becomes a very abusive relationship. I wouldn't even say almost abusive. I think it gets really abusive. And Brundle is very clear about, I don't feel human anymore. I feel more insect. I'm becoming cruel, right? Insects are very cruel. And he's warning her, and we've seen him outside of the relationship becoming abusive with the woman that he picks up at the bar and brings in. Now she gets to leave, but perhaps only because Gina shows up and says, the catch line of the entire campaign, be afraid, be very afraid. So she rescues that woman.
Yeah.
But we see right there how much more abusive the relationship's becoming. He just wants to sexually dominate a woman at that point, any woman. And this verifies what she says, what Gina says to him, you're changing. And it's not just the physical change. He's changing into an abuser. We're in a culture now that's telling an entire generation of women in America, you don't have constitutional rights. You don't have any right to privacy. We're going to control your biological life. You have to report to us everything about your biological life. We're there. Here in America, we're there. And it's fucked up and scary. And in a way, The Fly is a scary metaphor for what's happened in my country, in America right now. Without the telepods, we are now in a patriarchal culture that has once again dominated and asserted a patriarchal rule that was not the status quo for a generation, almost 2 generations. And now we're back there, unfortunately.
Now you do have insect politicians.
We really do have insect politicians, Lindsay, and they are complete sociopaths, and they are cruel, and they are calculated, and everything Goldblum says in that speech could come right off our Senate floor or House floor, and shamelessly so. So yeah.
Goodness.
Oh, sorry. Didn't mean to knock us into that one.
Yeah.
I will say this about The Fly is I want to stress again, it's a remarkably playful film. There's a lot of, even when the worst shit's happening, Goldblum's performance is amazing in this film, and that whole sequence alone in the bathroom with the mirror is like, oh my God, because the way he plays it is, it's grotesque and horrible, but he's a scientist through and through. So he's fascinated by what the hell is happening to me now. And I have transgender friends who have said to me, Cronenberg's the only filmmaker where they've seen the kind of body diaspora that, they experienced themselves taken to the more extreme level, just as in The Brood, psychoplasmics is taking forms of therapy to a more extreme level. And this film becomes a portrayal of a character going through not just gender change, but an entire species change. And he's not turning into a fly. He says very clearly, I'm something else. I'm Brundle Fly. He's the only one. And Cronenberg's back in familiar territory then, because Rose is the only one in Rabid of her kind. Nola, as far as we know, is the only one. The Brood doesn't end with a typical 50s movie ending where, Frank goes back to the police station. The police says, there's another case of Brood breaking out in California. They didn't go there. So, he's in familiar territory of, okay, let's watch what happens when a new a completely new entity, a completely new species is born. And what happened?
Yeah, and I think that that playful nature you talk about, I think, is seen a lot in the way that he's, as a scientist, he wants to document every stage of it. So I think that allows us to take that journey with him, because he's got this clinical aspect to it, so we can experience that along with him. But yeah, and it is gross and it is disturbing, but that process, I think, the way that's broken down allows the audience to go along with it.
Yeah, it does, including things like his teeth falling on the keyboard, and he goes, "You're an archaeological relic." He's immediately talking to his teeth.
He has the little containers with all his bits.
Yeah, what's it? The Brundle Museum of Natural History.
Yeah,
his medicine
God. And
cabinet.
we get that glimpse of the bathroom shelf, and it's like, oh my God, I don't want to know. So
yeah,
and I think that also goes to towards Chris Waller's sort of makeup effects and everything, like the extraordinary effects that are used to show that transformation. Yeah, do you have any thoughts on that, on his work? I mean, I know it was Oscar nominated.
Oh, it's astonishing. I know a lot of people don't like it, but I'm also a fan of The Fly 2, which Chris directed as well as did the effects work for.
I didn't particularly like it. I saw it for the first time. I was, not into it as much.
But it's not, it's not The Fly. It's not it's nowhere near the Cronenberg stuff, but on its own terms, I enjoyed it. And so I'm not going to champion it, but in terms of what Chris did, I think the work he did in Fly 2 with the makeup effects and animatronics. I mean, there's sequences in The Fly once the transformations run its course where we're no longer looking on makeup on Jeff Bloom. We're looking at entire creatures that were fabricated. It's remarkable. It's also remarkable early in the film. I mean, the first glimpse of special effect we get is that poor baboon turned inside out inside the telepod. And it's like, it was really smart because it's a gradual transformation. His face starts to get, almost like an acne discoloration to it. And then later in the film, I love that first scene when Gina comes in and she doesn't know where to look. And the camera's up high looking down on her and he's up above her. And he pulls up his shirt and he goes, "What's this?" I don't know. And we don't see it clearly enough to think, like, what the hell is that? Is that another limb growing under his skin or something? Yeah. I also like the fact that, vivid as it is, Mark Irwin's cinematography is really smart in both these films, right? The Brood, Mark was the cinematographer who worked with Cronenberg until it ran its course, ending with The Fly. And they were a great collaborative team. And part of it is Mark knew, in collaboration with Chris Wallace, how these effects needed to be shot. It's not overlit. It doesn't look rubbery. Even close-ups of, like, we get that close shot of his transformed hands when he's working at the keyboard. And it's completely convincing to this day. And it was seamless when we saw it in 86. Now, with a more educated eye, rewatching it, I can see when the animatronic takes over. But seeing it with an audience when the film was new, I mean, people were screaming at the end of that movie because we had not seen anything as believably put together as this. And Chris Wallace's makeup work in here. But it's also Jeff Goldblum's performance. Jeff, it's almost unbearable when he's in the later stage and he's struggling to keep his humanity. And Jeff does this thing with his tongue and his lips that's just like, oh, and you can see he's really trying to hang on, and he even says to her, "I don't want to hurt you," because he's afraid he will, and he does. He's going to, but he doesn't know what he's turning into. He just knows he's turning into something dangerous, which is the leap that Nola couldn't make, which is the leap that Revok couldn't make, but it was the leap that Stephen Lack's characters and Scanners could make, and now it's the leap that Brundle can make. He knows when he's become something other than human, and he warns her to stay away, but he can't stay away from her. Especially, how would this climax have played out if he hadn't been on the roof and overheard what idiot Stathis says out loud to her, which gives away, oh, she's pregnant. And suddenly he has the imperative to reintegrate the family unit biologically. Stathis is such a scumbag in this movie.
He's really awful.
But it's funny, again, in interviews with Cronenberg, he was saying that he was having some trouble finding an actor because they didn't want to have all the makeup, that they thought they wouldn't be able to act through the makeup. And Jeff Goldblum, I think he was saying that, especially later stages, it would really weigh down on his eyes.
Oh, yeah.
That must have been really hard. But I think the thing about the effects in the film, Cronenberg says it was never just gloop, it was always conceptual gloop.
Difference.
And this whole thing is like the effects are not a spectacle. It's so integral to the story. And there's also, I think, and it's something that's throughout Cronenberg's work, is that the horror just comes from the facts of biology.
Right.
Like the whole thing is like, well, if like, it does seem like they obviously must have done some research, like how would a human fuse with a fly? And this whole thing of like, well, how would you eat? And there's definitely a focus on food a lot throughout the film. You've got the steak that tastes synthetic and the cheeseburger.
Yeah, exactly. Going back to cheeseburger. Yep.
And when they're having the cheeseburger and she asks about the experiments, obviously referring to the baboon, and he says, not while we're eating. Mm-hmm. But then I think, doesn't she makes a reply later on like, oh, it can't be any worse than this.
She holds up the burger. Yeah, exactly. She says that immediately, Lindsay. Right. It's like, yes, yeah. And food is very important throughout. Yeah, that's part of why I think that's part of why I said I think it's such a witty script, is it touches on eating, sex, all this primal stuff without putting any of them in the foreground unduly. Like we're not getting product placement. We're not aware of that burger except as an object of disgust when she, holds it up. I just think it's brilliantly one of the things I learned when I worked with Alan Moore on Swamp Thing, when he was writing Swamp Thing, as a writer, I learned so much from Alan. And one of the things I learned is Alan could craft a script for our comic book that involved all the reader's senses, your sense of smell, sense of touch, right? Most comics and most films are only thinking in visual and narrative terms. Alan was always thinking, how do I engage all the reader's senses? And I feel like with The Fly, Cronenberg's there, right? Whether it's subliminal or overt, we're constantly aware of odor, right? She says, you smell bad. And every time we go back to that apartment, there's more and more trash. When Stathis walks into Brundle's flat at the end, he crinkles his nose like, oh my God, it stinks in here. Like, and these are things you don't, as with Alan Moore, that David Cronenberg doesn't have to put in our face. They don't have to play it up, but it's there. And it makes all of this feel more real. It lends this sense of not false, but genuine immediacy and urgency to every narrative beat, even the leisurely beats, even the things like she is the one who initiates the first sexual coupling of the couple. And by the end of the film, he's the one that's trying to force her into this new form of coupling using the teleport, not 2, but 3 teleporters, right? So, in every way, Cronenberg engages us on a sense level. I'm afraid to use the word sensual because that only involves, sexuality for most people when they hear the word sensual. But it is a very sensual film, both in terms of the sexuality of the characters, but also engaging our senses fully. Our sight, our hearing. We hear that fly before he gets in the telepod. I mean, he cues us where this is going. I love how tactile the film is too, right? I mean, when the pod opens after the successful teleportation of the baboon, we don't know what's going to come out of that telepod, and we're afraid we're going to get another grotesque inside-out creature. And the baboon leaps into Jeff Goldblum's arms, and it's this kind of intimacy between him and the animal that's instantly endearing. We're like, oh, cool, and I always wonder, like, what was that like on the set? I mean, that's a real baboon. Like, how cuddly are they? And the film plays off of that without pushing it in our face. When Goldblum's getting drunk and feeling jealous, he's talking to the baboon, which is casually sitting in a chair. And once Brundle goes into teleporter, there's a cutback to the baboon who's so bored he's pulled the cushion apart on the chair. He's like playing with the stuffing. I think it's part of what makes the film feel genuine, because it is genuine in that regard. And I think that embodies a whole new maturation of Cronenberg as a filmmaker. He's now engaging us in ways he hadn't even been able to conceive of earlier in his career. Because, learning how to direct a film it's like, I always say to people that thinks doing comics is easy, I'm like, what do you think of ballet? Like, try it. And Cronenberg was finally at the level as a filmmaker where he could orchestrate all these elements, and he had a crew that he was comfortable working with. Carol Spear, his wife Denise with the costuming, Mark Irwin with the cinematography. I mean, they had a tight group, and he's now able to work as a filmmaker. All the elements are in his control, and he knows how to orchestrate them into what he wants us to feel as the audience, and pulls it off beautifully.
Well, that's the thing with Cronenberg, is that he's always considered to be, very cold and clinical, because you do have this scientific rationale behind, what we're seeing in these films and how things develop and how characters develop and change and transform. But yet at the same time, you have what we keep talking about, the visceral reaction, the really bodily, visceral reaction to his work. And then also, I think with The Fly in particular, it's such a deep emotional experience as well, because of the romance, because we really buy into this couple. And so, the transformation and decline of Seth, it's played out, like someone dying slowly of a disease. And, many of people at the time, they're talking about the AIDS allegory. And I always think of the moment, the kind of clash of all of this is when Veronica goes to see Seth and he's starting to decline. When she hasn't seen him in, I think, about 4 weeks, and he comes out.
And he's on the walkers. And,
and he vomits.
Pain. Yes.
But then also there's he vomits, and it is really, really disgusting, and she's disgusted. But then as the scene ends, and then his ear falls off, which again, she's like, oh, but at the end of the scene, she just hugs him. And it's this whole thing of like, she hugs him on the side where his ear is, and there's all this goop, but she's just so sympathetic and overwhelmed and feeling for him that it doesn't matter. She's going to hug him anyway and try and comfort him. And I think that scene is so, like, it encapsulates it all. But I guess we'll just talk a bit more about what is it about this transformation that is so kind of Cronenbergian that you have all these allegories that people are reading into.
I just turned 71 a week and a half ago. I've experienced my own version of what happens in this film, when you visit somebody you hadn't seen in a period of time, and the aging process has taken a toll, and it's particularly dramatic when it's a friend. I've had a number of friends who died from alcoholism and so on. And I go back, I think when I revisited The Fly, it just brought a lot of that back to me very vividly. And I'm not being morbid here. I think Cronenberg was reacting and channeling how he felt about his father dying, the process of having to deal with his father, Milton, who had been an incredible writer, stimulating father presence in David's life. And here's his body failing. Here's Milton's body failing Milton. And his mind was still sharp to the end from what I've read, but his body was failing. And I think that informed what we see with the transformation of Brundle. It's as much, everybody seized on, AIDS as being the immediate cultural element that this was somehow a metaphor for. But, in a way, it's a consolidation of how do you keep a loving relationship alive as you age? And we've had films more recently like Amour, the remarkable film in which, the wife is suffering from Alzheimer's or a form of dementia, and the loving husband is trying to figure out, like, how do I do this? Like, how can I still love her? She doesn't even know who I am. Those are more realistic, dramatic presentations of what Cronenberg consolidated into The Fly. Part of why we react the way we do to this relationship is this is one of the first horror films that was comfortable with the pleasure mode before it got into the disgust mode of the narrative, right? I love the dialogue around the steak. Like, I've got to teach the computer how to love the flesh, how to go crazy for the flesh, right? And we're shown the pleasure this couple finds in each other, and not just, sexually, but as companions, as human beings, right? She finds him charming and goofy and naive because he is. And, you haven't gotten out much, we see how, not antisocial, but non-socialized he is. That little revelation of his closet where all the clothes are the same clothes. He can just change them every day. We've also seen how his relationship with her awakens him. He becomes a better person because of their being together. And she nurtures and enjoys that, but she's not being manipulative about it. She's just really falling in love with him and doing her job as a journalist by chronicling what he's doing, because that's their deal. They got all this going, but she's genuinely in love with him. And as you point out, Lindsay, even when he's in the stage of degeneration, I mean, the whole audience groaned when she hugged him. And the only other film I remember that happening in was Mary Lambert's adaptation of Pet Sematary at the very end. When the wife comes back and she's like that separating ooze coming out of her flesh, and she goes and her husband hugs her. And I just remember the audience like, oh, end of movie, And for Cronenberg, it's just a grace note because it's, even Brundle says when she reacts in disgust at his vomiting, he goes, oh, that's disgusting, isn't it? Like, he hasn't realized that yet. It's just how he eats now.
Yeah.
So I think part of that works in the film the way it does because we have vicariously, in an intimate enough way for mainstream film to work, enjoyed the pleasure they take in each other. And now we're going to go through all those transitions with them. And it's always believable that she goes back up there, that he calls her and she doesn't just go, fuck off. Like, I'm done, right? It's because he wasn't an abusive partner. She does love him. She still loves him. And, I've gone to visit dying alcoholic friends where it was hard to get in the car and go see them another week because it was going to be another big step down the ladder. And it was sad and heartbreaking and terrible. And I also was afraid, how am I going to be manipulated this time? One of my friends who was an alcoholic, I used to take him for drives, and he tricked me into taking him to a store where he could buy some booze. And I was so pissed. But I didn't get mad at him. I mean, he was dying. And his wife patiently explained to me that the hospital had given up on him because of their insurance situation, and they'd made a decision he was just going to drink himself to death. But I still felt used. I felt like I didn't get a choice in this. So all of that comes up for me when I'm watching this film again, and I understand Gina's character going back up to that fucking place where he is, and just the way it's structured as she walks in, there's food trash everywhere up there, and many of us have had experiences with friends who were hoarders or whatever, and that's part of the dynamic as well. It's all here in The Fly. And it rings true. It doesn't ring false. It rings very true.
This also reminds me of Dead Ringers, how in their apartment towards the end, it just all they're just all surrounded, but they have each other. Whereas I think that's another reason why Veronica goes back, is because there is no one else who would go.
There is no one. I mean, who else does she have? Stathis, who is like, it's interesting that Cronenberg named him Stathis.
Stathis Borans.
And also, you have no reason to know this, but I used to contribute as a freelancer to Heavy Metal. One of the editors at Heavy Metal for a number of years was Lou Stathis, who was really into cyberpunk and punk music. He transformed the magazine for a time into a much better magazine. And during that period of time, Tim Lucas interviewed David Cronenberg for Heavy Metal. And I always thought he must have gotten that name from Lou, because it's such a great name for the character. It also, you're right. I mean, what else does Jennifer have at that point in the film? And now she's caught between these two thankless relationships. You know, the one she's still emotionally invested in, her partner is degenerating and turning into who knows what. And her abusive boyfriend is her boss. She still has to deal with him. She can't get him out of her life, even though she's pretty firmly said no. We see that in their first scene together in the apartment. And he's just not going to have it. He keeps trying to barter. He's shameless, and he just doesn't give up. It's great that he's there to disable her telepod at the end, but why is he going up there with a shotgun in the first place? You know, that's not a particularly positive action on Stathis' part either. So,
because he's gone there with that very specific intent.
Yeah, I'm going to kill him. Right. I'm going to kill him. And it's interesting to me, that moment in the film. I mean, Cronenberg's very comfortable with firearms, and he has been for a number of films at this point. I think of the comfort of the assassins with their firearms and scanners. And this moment at the end of The Fly, I brought back to Christopher Walken's character, Johnny, in Dead Zone, where we're shown him, you know, becoming comfortable with a firearm so that he can assassinate Martin Sheen's politician. And that moment when Stathis opens the case, it's like, you know, this is escalating further than we feared it might escalate. Cronenberg was one of the few, and maybe this is part of being Canadian. I mean, American filmmakers introduced firearms without a thought. It's very rare to have a film like Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven, where every gun is a character, and we are made absolutely conscious as an audience, time and time and time again, how terrible these weapons are, and each one has a name in the film, Unforgiven, because they're objects of destruction. And his character Money is completely consumed with all the people he's killed. Cronenberg does that with one shot in The Fly. When Stathis opens that case, like, oh my God, that says so much. And I find it interesting that a Canadian filmmaker brings that import to that moment in a way that all the American filmmakers in '86 never did. Like, firearms are like, okay. So that to me is also a powerful part of The Fly.
For sure.
And I think also alongside that, you know, the attitude towards Veronica wanting an abortion is dealt with. That's one thing about Stathis. He's detestable in every other aspect of the film, except when she says to him, I'm pregnant. And I think his response is basically, what do you want to do? And right. he actually is. Yeah. And he goes with her. And I think actually in Canada, abortion was kind of legalized later than in America. I can't remember exactly.
Yes, I believe you're right. Actually, in Canada, it was province by province, much like the States, where it was state by state. But yes. Yeah, I mean, it's the first virtue we see from Stathis. He's not only supportive, he's aggressive in getting her the help she wants. When her sense of urgency is, I want this out of me right now, he finds a doctor. He's got her at a doctor that night. In fact, the doctor is alarmed at how quickly this is going. And there's no practical way that either Veronica or Stathis can say, well, she might have been impregnated by a human fly. Like, that's just not, you're not going to say that to an abortionist. That's going to be the end of the meeting. Yeah, I mean, it is the first virtuous thing the character does. And he's tirelessly committed to helping her at that point. But it's also his fuck up. I mean, if they had just waited to get in the car to have that conversation, you know, Brundle wouldn't have ever heard what he heard from the roof, and it wouldn't have kicked into the overdrive that it does. But that's how it goes. That's how it went. When did you two first see The Fly, by the way? Did you get to see it in theaters, or does this predate your...
It predates. I mean, I would have seen it on video. Well, although we did get to see it in this at a cinema, like, repertory screening years and years ago back in Australia. But yeah, for me, it would have been as I was getting into Cronenberg. So a lot of the films that Cronenberg has made in Australia are rated R, and our R rating means that it's illegal for anyone under 18 to see it. although you could get around, you could try and get around. I had an older brother and sister who would help me out. And at one point, I think my parents even were like, oh, she's into movie. Look, we can't stop this. Although they would have to see. So there were certain things that my mom was like, I remember when I showed her, I had to show her the cover of what I wanted to get if it was rated R. And Blue Velvet was one that she said, no. On the back of the VHS cover, it says something about Frank and his sadistic sexual fantasies, and my mum was like, maybe not. But yeah, I think my parents were obviously familiar with The Fly, but yeah, I think it would have been later on, once I was of age to kind of get the film out myself, that I saw it. What about you?
Yeah, I think it was quite late for me. I think it probably even would have, I don't know if it was on video or DVD even, but I think I remember coming to it quite late after watching quite a few. I think I even saw The Brood before I saw The Fly, but it was one of those things I've always meant to watch it. And yeah, I think I remember coming to it quite late, having seeing quite a few of his films, and being just kind of, really impressed by the fact, because you can tell that this is like a big budget studio film compared to his other, especially the ones leading up to this, and how he was able to kind of adapt himself to that kind of level of filmmaking, but also bringing all of his own ideas to it. Yeah, I was surprised at how sort of late. I think I even saw Naked Lunch before I saw The Fly. Like, it's weird.
Yeah.
Like how late I came to it.
It would have been on TV, but I can imagine on television it would have been so butchered.
Oh, butchered. Yeah. Now, did you grow up seeing the original Fly on television? It was on TV all the time when I was a kid growing up, the 1958 one.
No, we watched it the other night actually in preparation for this, that I'd never seen it. I'd seen clips of it on, like, there are movies where people are watching it, but I'd never seen the whole film in its entirety. So
I'd seen it years and years ago, and I think it had been on like Australian cable television, and I'd seen it many years ago, but it wasn't around. The remake, The Fly, would have been around much more than the original.
Yeah, my friend, I've got a friend in Australia, Daniel Best, who writes a lot about media, horror films, and so on. And he's educated me about, how rare horror movies were on Australian television when he was growing up. It was nothing like the access we had. I mean, my friends and I, when I was a kid, we would go, "Help me, please!" And we all knew it was The Fly that we were quoting. So it was a real cultural touchstone, the original one, in a lot of ways. I also want to mention Jeff Goldblum's performance that we've talked about. There's a predecessor I want to bring to your attention that Tim Lucas thinks Cronenberg knew of, because when Tim got to interview and spend time with David, Tim actually was on the set of Videodrome up in Canada. He discovered what was on the TV when Cronenberg would be upstairs in his writing studio, and he would often have the TV on. And at the time, the 1960s TV show The Outer Limits was being broadcast in Canada. And there's a remarkable episode of The Outer Limits. In fact, so remarkable that when it was first broadcast, a lot of local stations preempted it, didn't show it at prime time, showed it after the news, late night, is an early episode called The Architects of Fear. And I bring it up because it's about Robert Culp plays a man in a group of scientists who draws the short straw in this scheme they're going to surgically transform one of themselves into an alien in order to try to mobilize the attention of the American government toward this alien enemy as a way of short-circuiting war on Earth. And Culp gives a performance that's almost like a dry run of certain aspects of Jeff Goldblum's performance. There's two scenes in particular with Culp giving a remarkable performance where he's becoming less and less human and is losing his humanity. And then there's a later film that very few people talk about, in which Chris Sarandon, of all actors, gives a performance just as good as Goldblum's in Dan O'Bannon's The Resurrected, which is an adaptation of the H.P. Lovecraft novella, The Strange Case of Charles Dexter Ward. And Sarandon is, I'm serious, he's as good as Jeff Goldblum is in The Fly, in playing a man who's being transformed into his ancestor. But it's this monstrous transformation that's overtaking him. And I don't think Dan O'Bannon had the directorial chops that Cronenberg had, He never got to make as many movies as Cronenberg had by the time Cronenberg had done The Fly. But I think both those might be interesting reference points for some of your listeners to go and check out in the context of The Fly.
Definitely for me. I mean, didn't know about The Resurrected. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I think you'll enjoy it. Yeah.
And one of the things that struck me watching the original Fly again, the 1958 version, because it had been decades since I had seen it, is the fact that it does focus so much on the wife character, that she is the protagonist.
Yes.
And I guess the one thing that unites the 58 Fly and the 86 is that it ends with the woman having to kind of mercifully kill her husband, lover. And one of the things that I really liked about watching The Fly again is Gina Davis's character, Veronica, and how we've kind of talked about that. Yeah, Seth is this kind of very insular, nerdy guy, and she's much more worldly. And, one of the things that struck me watching it again is the whole thing of that definitely I don't think he would have made the steps that he made without her input, but also the fact that she's documenting it with him and that she's the one holding the camera. So so it feels like that she is kind of, it's all about her looking at him, and that she is the bearer of the look, and that she's looking upon him. I mean, the first shot of the film is him answering a question to her. So it's almost like we're seeing through her eyes from the very first shot in the film. Because he's saying, well, what am I working on? She's obviously just asked him that.
Well, and in the vernacular of early feminist film studies, it's the female gaze that we're getting. We see more nude Jeff Goldblum in this film than we ever see of Gina Davis, right? I mean, he's really he's the one being seen. And when Veronica's not on screen, we're still seeing him in the way that the male gaze is typically used with female characters in, male-driven films. He's either topless or nude. He's reveling in his physicality. We're still kind of seeing Brundle through her eyes, even through those sequences. I also think that's interesting. I mean, she is the most active of all the female protagonists in Cronenberg's films up to this point, and including Jennifer O'Neill in Scanners, who's presented, as a pacifist. So that immediately makes her not as assertive as the two dueling brothers in Scanners would be. And she's also mirrored in the next film by Genevieve Bujold's character in Dead Ringers. The big difference I remember between The Fly and Dead Ringers, I mean, The Fly had a devastating ending, but the audience left having had such a ride that the adrenaline was up, right? I mean, I don't remember people coming out of the theater looking bummed out. When I saw Dead Ringers with one of my friends, Stanley Weotter, who, built a career interviewing horror writers and horror filmmakers, Stanley almost got us in a car accident because he was so bummed out by Dead Ringers. He almost got us killed or injured. Dead Ringers was like being hit repeatedly with a board by the end of that film. It just was such a dark ride. But the most proactive character in The Fly is Gina Davis's character, and the most active character in Dead Ringers is Genevieve Bujold's character. Especially, I love that scene where she says, and you're the shit, when she figures out two brothers, the game they've been playing. I think Dead Ringers is David reorienting himself toward more introspective cinema after having done The Fly, where it was so dedicated to the woman's point of view and the woman character being the active character. Goldblum is really a pretty passive character in this film. Everything happens to him. Yeah. In fact, even his self-teleporting is an act of jealousy because he thinks she's with Stathis that night. She's with her old boyfriend. So he does something stupid. He gets drunk and puts himself through the teleporter, and all the calamity that follows is because of that stupid act. Gina's the one whose character is moving around the most in the film. She's the most proactive. She's the one who pulls herself away from both male relationships when she can't handle it anymore. She's the one who is being proactive in replying to that phone call from Brundle and daring to go back up there, even after having warned another woman away and saved that woman's life because she knows something terrible is happening to him. She's an amazing character in this. And there weren't many films in 86 that were that came from a major studio like 20th Century Fox. But it was an interesting compliment to Sigourney Weaver's character.
I was just thinking that,
in the James Cameron Aliens film as well. It's just Gina has a camera instead of a giant futuristic firearm she's toting around.
And it's funny, I was reading that, the film ends quite abruptly, and a lot of Cronenberg's films just kind of end. And I was reading that they had ideas for multiple endings. One of them being that it would show like kind of later after killing Seth, and that Veronica was in bed with Stathis and she was now pregnant. And then there was also something about that there was a scene with the baby, but it would have like these beautiful wings or something.
Yeah, yes.
Rather
yeah,
than, yeah. And that they realized that, none of them really worked. I'm kind of glad because I don't want her to end up with Stathis.
No, and I don't want her to end up with a baby with little wings, because my first thought would be, well, what's it going to metamorphose into later? Which leads us to The Fly too, inevitably.
Yeah.
So.
For me, it just seems like, she ends up having the baby. The fact that she was trying to get abortion, that it would still be like, oh, no, she doesn't do that.
Right.
We flirted with that, but we're not going to go there.
Right. Which is flinching, which is a way of flinching. Cronenberg makes horror movies. Horror movies are dark rides. And there's a consistency to those dark endings of his films. His most upbeat endings are things like, all the parasite infected people in the towers getting into their cars and driving out to infect Montreal. What a happy ending that is. The end of Scanners, where there's Revik's body, but it's the voice of the brother. We've won, Kim, we've won. And it's like, oh, really? Most of his films, I'm thinking of the end of Rabid, where we watch Rose's body just being thrown into the back of a garbage truck. It's like, talk about a devastating and terrible ending where she's reduced to a piece of offal, of garbage. And I think Cronenberg, I think that's part of his genre language is, those bleak endings are part of the ride. James Woods blows his brains out. End of Videodrome. Johnny does not survive his assassination attempt on Martin Sheen's politician. He succeeds in diffusing the politician's career, which he realizes by touching him, and he gets the flash forward of, that's it. This guy is not going to be the next president. The end of The Fly is like, well, where do you go from the moment when one member of the couple has to blow the other, their lover's brains out? It is an abrupt ending. He handles it as gracefully as possible. There's that slow motion aspect to it, and it does fade out, and then the credits come up. But I think, by after Night of the Living Dead in 1968, it's almost like we weren't going to believe an upbeat ending at the end of a horror movie, and it's not just Night of the Living Dead. It's Rosemary's Baby. It's The Conqueror Worm. It's, Witchfinder General. It's, horror movies just got to that point by the beginning of the 70s where it's like the bleak ending was part of the ride. And that's part of why it was a horror movie. And Cronenberg was of that 70s generation where it's like, all right, I'm going to play this out, to paraphrase Raglan, let's go right through it, right to the end. And it's not going to be there's no happy ending for Brundle and Veronica. They're not going to have a happy ending. And I'm glad we don't see her in bed with Stathis, because there's no fucking way that would have been a happy ending at all,
No way.
Especially Stathis in bed with his prosthetic hand and prosthetic foot,
Yeah.
That would have felt like such a betrayal. And I feel like the ending as it is just so emotional. You almost, I know many people who talk about that they're crying by the, it's just for me, it's when Brundlefly comes out of the telepod and just puts the gun to his
he's he's that twitching.
It's that last glimmer of humanity.
Yep. It's also, I also felt like that ending was Cronenberg's answer to the visibility of H.R. Giger's work in the pop culture at that time. Giger coined the phrase biomechanoid, right? As he was the artist whose remarkable artwork was adopted by Ridley Scott for the first film Alien in 1979. And by 1986, Aliens was the further mainstreaming of that biomechanoid look. And I think Cronenberg was going, no, this is what it would look like. And it's terrible. You know, it's like biological entity fused with inert, you know, inanimate matter. It's just a source of pain and agony. And there's no life to that to be lived. So, and that moment of him putting the barrel on his head, that's part of what makes me think of Architects of Fear as well. That episode of Outer Limits ended with Robert Culp and Robert Culp's character and his wife in that episode have this hand signal they do with each other where they move their finger down their forehead as like a little love, you know, expression of love. And that's what the alien's hand does. And that's when she knows, oh my God, this is my husband. And I feel like David took it to the next level at the end of The Fly. You know, when Brundle Fly picks up the barrel of the shotgun and puts it on his forehead, it's just like, end this, please, you know. And that's both Brundle, whatever's left of Brundle the human, and whatever he's become, just going, this is impossible to live any longer. Take me out. So, yeah, it's so sad. Yeah, people were crying at the end of the film. It was really, and to cry in a monster movie, you know, mainstream audience crying at the end of a monster movie, bring it on. I didn't see that again until Twilight, where I was the only male in an all-female audience in a packed theater. And I didn't see it again until the end of Shape of Water, Del Toro's film, you know, where I was blown away by mainstream audiences flocking to those movies. I never thought I'd see a vampire movie where I'd be the only guy in the theater surrounded by mothers and daughters, you know. And, you know, what Cronenberg did with The Fly, I think, was a real genre breakthrough. It was the point where normal mainstream audiences realized, like, these movies are speaking to us really clearly. And we'd had prior blockbusters. I'm not saying it's the first one, you know, Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist. There have been plenty of big mainstream embraced horror movies, but I'd never seen an audience crying at the end of a mainstream audience crying at the end of a horror movie until The Fly.
I do feel like we've
beaten this Brundle Fly to death, haven't we?
There we go. Well, we talked about sad endings, and now we can have a more happy ending.
Yes, yeah. It's a much happier ending. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been so great.
Oh, my great pleasure. I'm honored that the two of you invited me in, and
the honor is ours.
I'm happy to come back anytime. I'm really glad that it was these two films. I love what you folks have been doing with the podcast, and I love, you know, this genre, particularly this fusion genre that you're focusing on. So feel free to reach out anytime. I'd be happy to join you again.
Absolutely. SciFrights is hosted, produced and edited by Liam Dunn and Lindsay Hallam.
Theme music by Damo Alexander and Rosie Gilbey.
Artwork by Millie Hallam.
And please follow us on social media on Instagram, Facebook, Bluesky, YouTube and Letterboxd.
And please rate and review our podcast wherever you get your podcasts and share it with someone you know. It really does help.